Chapter 9:11 Strange scene. Klein looked down at his palm as his eyes reflected the gold coin. It was heads. This meant that Klein should use the marionette's eyes to look at himself. After receiving this revelation, Klein remained hesitant. He pondered about holding a ritual to send Enzo above the gray fog. Doing so was relatively safer, allowing the damage and corruption his spirit body suffered to be completely screened by the environment before making an attempt. However, he suspected that he wouldn't receive an outcome. This was because Beyonders of the Fate pathway were noticing the projection of the mysterious space on his body. Above the gray fog, that uniqueness might no longer exist. It was like an attempt to observe an elephant's body. Instead of doing it outside, he was doing it internally. Pressing his fingers together, he clenched the gold coin in silence for a long while before making up his mind. He suddenly stood up, took out a ritual dagger, and created a wall of spirituality to isolate the room. This was to prevent anyone from hearing the possible screams or strange commotion. Immediately after that, Klein set up a ritual and sacrificed creeping hunger above the gray fog. He was afraid that the glove would turn on him when something happened to him. This was a fixed trait of creeping hunger itself. Once it didn't have its fill and couldn't secure a schedule of eating one person a day, it would view its wearer as food. And Klein starved it more often than he fed it. After doing all the preparations in a meticulous and orderly manner, Klein reached out to take the flower of blood from Enzo and wore it on his left palm. This ensured that he could recover even if he suffered any serious physical damage. At the moment he was about to wear it, Klein thought for a moment and paused. Taking a piece of paper, he wrote, "Remember to take off the ring." He was worried that he wouldn't take flower of blood off after his experiment due to his lowered intelligence. "When that happens, perhaps I need a beautiful princess to wake me up with a kiss, no take off my ring." Klein gave a self-deprecating laugh and exhaled. Removing his outerwear, he wore the ring. Then, he cast his gaze at his new marionette, winner Enzo. The sense of crisis and nervousness was inevitable, but as long as he made up his mind, the experienced him could only forge ahead without flinching. After doing some adjustments and entering a state of cogitation, Klein made the marionette slowly turn around to look at him. With the winner's eyes, he first saw a layer of thin, emanating grayish-white fog. Amidst the fog, there was a resplendent door of light that was tainted with bluish blackness. The door of light was formed from countless layers of spherical light. Each spherical light enveloped squirming maggots. Some of them were transparent, others translucent. They had complicated and indescribable symbols and patterns that had profound meanings. Before Klein could discern the actual details, he felt his mind buzz as he lost consciousness. After an unknown period of time, he slowly woke up. He had momentarily lost his memory, almost imagining that he had slept till daybreak. What happened? It's still dark outside. Klein sat up with a push of his hands, only to realize that he was on the ground. At this moment, he caught sight of Enzo through the corner of his eye. Plenty of scenes and voices suddenly surged through his mind. That's right. I was trying to figure out what Beyonders of the monster pathway can see from my body. I suffered too much stimulation and fainted immediately. I still vaguely remember painful screaming. Was that me? Klein, who had recovered his memories, hurriedly inspected his condition. He was surprised to see a bloody, gruesome wound on his body, as though something was about to tear out of it. At this moment, flesh was squirming in the wound, reforming at an abnormally fast speed. Klein then looked to the ground and saw that there was blood that had outlined a silhouette of where he was lying down. Thankfully, I wore flower of blood, otherwise, I might have slowly died due to the heavy injuries brought about by the breakdown of my body. After I resurrect, I wonder if I'll be in a human form or a monster form. Klein raised his hand and rubbed his temples as he scanned his surroundings. He found that the furniture had toppled, but the wall of spirituality remained intact. He heaved a sigh of relief, confirming that the abnormality was only limited to himself and a small area around him. Nothing had spread. And from the speed at which his wound was recovering at, Klein determined that he hadn't been unconscious for more than a minute. He picked up the chair and sat down, feeling as though he had forgotten something, but he just couldn't recall what. Only when he instinctively cleared the area did he see a note with the words, "Remember to take off the ring." Only then was he enlightened as he removed the golden ruby ring on his left hand. More memories surfaced as Klein shook his head and muttered with a lingering sense of fear and amusement, "Luck is really important at times. If the negative effects of the flower of blood randomly reached its peak potency, I might not be able to recognize those words and fail to be reminded." Seeing that he had mostly recovered from his wound, he made Enzo wear flower of blood and take off green essence. Using the latter's treatment, Klein no longer felt any discomfort. He focused his attention back on the scene he saw. It was a scene that Beyonders of the Fate pathway saw on him. A door of light tainted with bluish black. Countless spherical lights. Transparent and translucent maggots clumped together. Symbols and patterns that are mystically complicated, hiding plenty of knowledge but giving zero feedback to others. What do these represent? This is a particular mythical creature form that corresponds to the mysterious space above the gray fog. It's one that belongs to a sequence, O true God. Due to the gray fog screening, only Beyonders of the Fate pathway can see it directly, suffering the visual impact and corruption. Likewise, it's also because of the gray fog screening that those Beyonders don't directly break down as though they are seeing a deity with their own eyes while also not receiving any knowledge. Klein thought for a moment and began to use divination to decipher the hidden meaning. The door of light seems to resemble the symbol behind the apprentice's chair. It might also point to Mr. Door. Countless stacked spherical light is identical to my cogitation. And the latter stems from the mythical systems as described by some novels from Earth. Influenced, my subconscious chose the most relevant and closely matching memory? Or could it be that my choice influences the expression of the scene from the gray fog? The distorted and transparent maggots are similar to the clump of maggots on the gigantic throne on the main peak of the Hornaces mountain range, but there are some tiny differences. That sequence, O the Fool of the Seer pathway. I didn't manage to see the translucent ones clearly. It's hard to tell. Also, the bluish-black color keeps making me connect it to the depths of the mysterious space that I can't reach. Back when I stood on the highest step of the staircase of light, I could see some hints of bluish-black on the cloud-like mass that condensed in midair. Klein thought about it for quite some time but failed to receive an answer. All he could do was keep it at the back of his mind and analyze it when he had more information and clues. After clearing the scene, he took 4 steps counterclockwise and went above the gray fog. He planned on doing a thorough inspection of his physical condition and confirm if Enzo still had any passive luck or bad luck. Biyao. In the poverty district, in a dilapidated house that wasn't too big. Admiral of Stars Katlia was sitting behind a table looking at the door when she heard a unique knocking pattern on the door. "Come on in." She didn't deliberately disguise her voice. The wooden door creaked open as the hanged man walked in, wearing a hooded black robe. Seeing his suspicious disguise, Katlia nudged her heavy glasses and said with a smile, "If you were to walk out like this, you would be surrounded by the members of the Church of Storms within 5 minutes." She didn't wear any disguise because she knew that the matter of her permitting Gehrman Sparrow to board the future had long spread across the seas. It wasn't difficult for the hanged man to guess that Admiral of Stars was Ma'am Hermit. Alger didn't directly reply to her. As he closed the door, he pulled out a chair and snapped back, "It's the same for you." He meant that Admiral of Stars was just second to Admiral Hell amongst the 7 pirate admirals. Furthermore, she was suspected to have deep connections to Gehrman Sparrow. She was a target of pursuit by the Church of Storms and Church of Evernight. Her bounty had risen to £45,000, and no matter which city she was in, it only spelled trouble once she was recognized due to not being disguised. Katlia nodded slightly and turned to look at the hanged man's hooded face. "In front of me, such a disguise is meaningless. However, I respect your choice." She continued wearing her glasses. She has a domineering stance and great confidence. As expected of the Admiral of Stars. Alger, who was wearing a mask under the hood, didn't harp on the disguise as he went straight to the point. "Thank you for providing me with assistance." Katlia placed her right hand on her left elbow. "I'm curious. With your present strength and the resources you have, you should be able to resolve the artisan's problem even without my help. Why are you being excessive? Alger was already prepared as he succinctly replied, I do not wish to become a topic of discussion for others. Katlia seemed to grasp the meaning in between the lines. Pondering for a few seconds, she said, I need more information. Alger nodded lightly and said, according to my observations and guesses, the artisan is likely controlled by those who believe in the primordial moon. The latter belong to the original faction of the southern continent, not the traders of the life school of thought. Katlia's expression remained unperturbed as she thought for a moment. Why don't you find Mr. Moon? He should be very interested in such matters. Alger curled his lips and replied in a normal tone, if we aren't able to resolve it, I might do so. Chapter 9:12 Origins of the Artisan. Katlia understood the hanged man. If the problem was too serious, they could use the moon to involve the entire sanguine race. They could then minimize their losses in the chaos and obtain some benefits. She then smiled and said, if the situation is that serious, why not directly find the world? That seems to make things simple. Alger remained silent for a few seconds before saying, I have to prove my ability at handling problems, therefore, that's the final resort. After hearing his reply, Katlia immediately made some connections. The hanged man places great importance on the way Gehrman Sparrow views him. It's because he's a blessed of Mr. Fool? Also, his attitude is rather identical to the political jokes of Backlund and Trier. When facing a problem or having committed a mistake, the first reaction is to suppress the matter and find other methods to resolve it. They cannot let their superior or consignor know about it. This means that the hanged man was once or is currently a member of a powerful faction with a strict hierarchy. It influenced him and made him grasp similar traits. The Church of Storms? No, such a person would be an oddity. The fleet of the King of the Five Seas? Amidst her thoughts, the pirate admiral nudged her heavy glasses and steered the topic back. Continued describing the artisan. Alger appeared to have prepared a script. Without any thought or pause, he said in an unhurried manner, to hide this artisan's identity, to prevent this resource from being wielded by others, I deliberately constructed the identity of him being part of the Church of Steam. But in fact, he had no choice but to create items for unaffiliated Beyonders to earn money to maintain his lifestyle of enjoying fine wine and beauties. He betrayed the Church of Steam and hid in Biyao. This time, he first contracted a strange disease and was monitored by an unknown person. Later, he seemed to be under control of people who believe in the primordial moon, claiming that he could receive new life. Katlia finished listening attentively as her eyes with a purple tint appeared extremely focused. After the hanged man finished his recount, she pondered and asked, an artisan definitely has no lack of mystical items. Furthermore, they know all the combinations of different Beyonder effects and negative effects. Their strength is definitely at sequence 5. What methods did those primordial moon believers use to control this artisan without harming him? A demigod was involved? Alger slowly shook his head. There aren't any clues regarding that, but based on my observation, the artisan has expressed some willingness. I suspect that, while being threatened and coerced, there are elements of them targeting his weaknesses to entice him. He had indirectly denied the theory that a demigod was involved. Katlia nodded. How did those primordial moon believers find this artisan? Based on your description, this artisan only trades with trustworthy friends he's familiar with. He doesn't enjoy widening his channels, and he can be said to be extremely cautious. Alger hesitated for a moment and said, I'm not too sure, but I have a theory. I once helped the world sell a werewolf Beyonder characteristic to that artisan, and the werewolf pathway belongs to the mutant pathway. Be it the formulas or characteristics, they are firmly in the control of the Rose School of Thought. There are seldom any leaks. Likewise, those people who believe in the primordial moon in the southern continent basically belong to the Rose School of Thought. Katlia added inwardly, having figured out the hanged man's theory. He suspected that the werewolf Beyonder characteristic had a latent problem that involved a secret existence. This resulted in the artisan being targeted by the Rose School of Thought. And this was also the reason why the Rose School of Thought firmly wielded control over the mutant pathway's formula and characteristics. Katlia raised a few more questions and obtained satisfactory answers. Finally, she asked, "What's that artisan's name? What country is he from?" "He's from Intis. He calls himself Sealf," Alger replied straight away. "Sealf," Katlia frowned slightly as she repeated the artisan's name softly. "What's wrong with that?" Upon seeing this, Alger directly asked, "You've heard of him?" From Alger's point of view, Admiral of Stars was an experienced powerhouse with a powerful background and was good at controlling herself. If she hadn't wished to discuss Sealf, she wouldn't have made it so clear even if she had her suspicions and questions. Due to this, he chose to ask without mincing his words. After a moment of silence, Katlia said, "Emperor Rosel's eldest son is Seal. It's very similar to that name." Without waiting for the hanged man to say a word, she continued, "This prince passed away due to his horror and concerns shortly after the emperor's assassination. Back then, the Sauron family wished to hang or exile his descendants, but the Church of Steam chose to take him in as a clergyman." Alger nodded slightly in enlightenment. "You suspect that he's a descendant of that prince?" In most countries in the northern continent like Intis and Faysac, it was common for people to use their ancestor's name or something similar as their names. It represented the legacy of honor, therefore, the more illustrious a family was, the more common it was to have the second or the third. Of course, it was also very common for two people to have similar names, but Artisan Sealf wasn't only a name. He was from the Church of Steam, a person from Intis, and had reached the level of artisan. Faced with the hanged man's question, Katlia nodded gently. "I can quickly make a confirmation if you can obtain his blood." Understanding the reason, Alger didn't ask further. Instead, he asked, "Are you going to take action now?" "I can provide support." Katlia's glasses reflected the crimson moonlight that shone inwards. "No, I plan on observing for some time. At the very least, we need to understand why the people who believe in the primordial moon are trying to control Artisan Sealf. If they only wish to get the artisan to work for them and create mystical items, the situation becomes a lot more simple. And if they have other goals, the problem might be more complicated than we imagined. We will need to make more preparations." As expected of the Admiral of Stars. Alger nodded and said, "I can't stay in Biyao for too long, or else I will incur suspicion. If you need my assistance, it needs to be fast." After receiving confirmation from her, the hanged man slowly got up and pulled up his hood before leaving the room. Having learned where Artisan Sealf was presently living, Katlia removed her heavy glasses and pinched her glabella. Clapping, she said, "Heath, come in." In the shadows of the door gap, the darkness suddenly stirred as a thin and tall but pale figure appeared. His nose bridge was ridiculously high, and his facial skin was nearly transparent. Looking ill, he was none other than the second mate of the future, Rose Bishop Heath Doyle. Katlia looked at him and said, "The actual situation is. I'll leave the rest to you." "Yes, Captain." Heath Doyle simply replied before shrinking back into the shadows. Katlia raised her right hand and paused for a few seconds. Stay away from Frank for the time being. He had reached a standstill in his mushroom experiments. I'm afraid that he will come up with new ideas. The location of my second marionette, Klein held two branches as he repeatedly chanted without seeing them move. This meant a divination failure or that Colaine City didn't have a second marionette that suited him well. From the looks of it, mysticism methods are temporarily useless. I'll pack up tomorrow and leave. Klein mumbled and threw the branches into the trash can. Standing beside him was Enzo. Although he didn't dare to directly look at his master and was only looking at the ground, he skillfully made a cup of black tea and offered it to Klein. Compared to before, this winner now had red skin that was nearly peeling due to sunburn. After all of this turned for the better, he would have a swarthy tan. To disguise his new marionette and prevent the Rose School of Thought from recognizing him, Klein had brought this gentleman on a trip to the beach which received strong sunlight. He was then left exposed to the sun for prolonged periods of time. Meanwhile, he controlled the marionette to shave off most of his hair, leaving a thin layer. With the trimming of his brows, contouring his face with powder, and wearing shades, Enzo seemed to transform into another person. Even the most familiar of friends of his might find it difficult to recognize him unless the person was a faceless. Apart from a disguise in the real world, Klein also did some mysticism management. Firstly, he used the paper angel's embrace, and second, he carried Azek's copper whistle along with it. In addition, he also determined that a winner's passive luck and calamity trait was ineffective. However, he had no idea if it was because of its status as a marionette, or if it was due to the gray fog. Receiving the tea and taking a sip, Klein cast his gaze at the map of East and West Balam on the coffee table. He considered where he could find his second marionette. At this moment, the colors around him suddenly saturated as though an artist had contoured the area with paint. Right on the heels of that, a figure appeared beside Enzo. He was wearing a silk top hat and a black suit. With a medium build, he had bronze skin and eyes that seemed to see the vicissitudes of life. He had soft facial features, and beneath his right ear was a tiny black mole. He was none other than Azek Eggers. Mr. Azek is finally here. Klein was first delighted before he noticed that he had appeared beside his marionette. This made an amusing scene surface in his mind. Mr. Azek, who had relied on the copper whistle to locate him, had done the same as he usually did, grabbing the copper whistle's wielder by the shoulder and had left using the spirit world the moment he appeared. And all Klein could do was watch helplessly, trying to stop him with outstretched arms. But being a tad bit slow, he couldn't help but clam up. Azek appeared more reticent than before. Looking at Klein, who had a new face, he asked, "Are you ready?" Chapter 9:13 Klein's preparatory work ready. Of course not. Klein smiled as he pointed at Enzo. That glove still needs sealing. As he spoke, the badly sunburnt Enzo removed the human-skinned glove from his right hand with his left hand, which wore the flower of blood and green essence rings. It was creeping hunger. Normally, Klein tended to throw creeping hunger above the gray fog when it wasn't in use. After all, the glove's original seal had been disabled after its mutation. It needed to consume a living person on a daily basis, otherwise, it would feast on the wearer. However, considering how Mr. Azek had already replied, it was very likely that he would meet him soon. Finally, he decided to keep creeping hunger in the real world unless there were unique circumstances. After all, he could already imagine the scene of Mr. Azek arriving. He didn't wish for such a conversation to happen. "Didn't you say that the glove needs sealing?" "Yes." "Give me a second. I need to use the washroom." Or, "Are you ready?" "No." "Give me a second. I need to use the washroom." Just the thought of a similar scene and similar line embarrassed Klein, making him feel awkward. Even if he didn't consider the possibility of Mr. Azek realizing the secret of the gray fog, this would also affect his impression of him. Therefore, after obtaining a new marionette and completing his attempt at looking at himself, Klein brought creeping hunger back to the real world, making up for its previous meal. Unlike before, the wearer was now Enzo. Aside from that, to restrain creeping hunger's urge to eat a person on a daily basis, Klein carried a few normal mushrooms with him. He also made the marionette maintain a distance of at least 5 meters from him. Upon hearing his words and seeing the marionette's actions, Azek nodded and reached out to receive the human-skinned glove. Taking this opportunity, Klein took out a few mushrooms from his pocket and threw them into the nearby trash can. "Paw!" He snapped his fingers, igniting the mushrooms within a scarlet flame. However, it didn't affect anything around it. This was his flame-controlling power from being a magician. After completing this action, seeing Mr. Azek inevitably glance over, Klein chuckled dryly. The unforeseen development back then has made creeping hunger a little afraid of mushrooms. I'm using its weakness to restrain its usual urges. In fact, there wasn't much point in doing so because carrying the mushrooms restrained creeping hunger. It made the starving sealed artifact immediately lash back the moment the mushrooms disappeared. Unless there was any easily obtainable food in front of it, it would end up aiding the enemy. Mushroom, Azek muttered as he held the glove which had blood stains on its surface. He made the surroundings suddenly turn dark as the sunlight outside was prohibited from entering. Ghastly white, dark green complicated symbols, labels, and patterns appeared out of thin air. They appeared to be calligraphed by invisible wraiths, shadows, and spirit bodies. They meshed together in midair, forming a mysterious, illusory double bronze door that seemed to lead to another world. It was a deep, silent, and terrifying world. The illusory door shrank and finally landed on Creeping Hunger, causing its blood stains to rapidly recede, making it mostly white. A few seconds later, this human-skinned glove returned to normal. It was still a thin layered glove, and even without any suppressive effect from the mushrooms, it didn't express any signs of mania or urges. It's like how it was before. Azek handed Creeping Hunger to Klein. Having a big shot backing you sure feels good. Klein reflected inwardly and earnestly thanked him before wearing Creeping Hunger on his left hand. He thought for a moment and raised a matter. Mr. Azek, while I was carrying your copper whistle while passing through the Berserk Sea, I had the same dream repeatedly. The main theme of the dream is darkness and coldness. In an inverted underground mausoleum, there were countless coffins with a deceased body inside. On their backs were dense white feathers. Those feathers were tainted with pale yellow oil, and deep inside the mausoleum was a blob of black fog that enveloped everything. In the dream, you and I were exploring the mausoleum. We triggered something, causing the black fog to produce panting sounds as thin illusory black tubes were extended. I would jolt myself awake whenever I reached this point in the dream. This seems to be similar to the byproduct of the Numinous Episcopate's artificial death project that previously appeared. Klein described, in detail, his divination of the copper whistle as a dream. He did this as a warning to Mr. Azek, as if to say that he shouldn't be too careless. After all, dream divination was, in a sense, equivalent to a dream, and Azek knew that he was a beyonder of the seer pathway. Having such an encounter wasn't anything odd. Having a revelation from a normal dream and getting a revelation from a dream divination only differed in one way, one being passive and the other active. Azek finished listening silently without cutting Klein off. At the end of that, he nodded and said, "It's likely related to something Death left in the Berserk Sea." From the looks of it, the Numinous Episcopate's artificial death project has had some qualitative progress. Mr. Azek lives up to being a fourth epoch death consul. He doesn't belittle my dream at all. Klein raised his right hand and rubbed his face, turning into Gehrman Sparrow. He then said, "I only have one more thing I need to prepare. I need to confirm if Admiral Hel Ludwell isn't somewhere dangerous and that there aren't any Numinous Episcopate demigods around him." As for whether the Murloc cufflink was still on the ship, Klein didn't mention it. This was because he would check on it every few days. He believed that Admiral Hel had yet to discover the mystical item, or he might have already discovered it but had deliberately not moved it, hoping to lay an ambush for the crazy adventurer. Gehrman Sparrow, when he visited Azek, replied calmly, "That can be confirmed when we are nearby." "All right." Klein immediately made Enzo walk to the coat rack and pull out the golden cane. Seeing that there was nothing else, Azek reached out his right hand and grabbed Klein's shoulder. Klein also reached out his right palm to grab onto Enzo's shoulder. The surrounding colors suddenly changed. The reds became redder, and the blacks became blacker. They stacked against each other but were bright and discordant. The two men and the marionette began passing through the spirit world as the black gold inlaid cane danced ahead, pointing out the direction of Klein's lost Murloc cufflink. Before long, the cane fell down and was suspended in midair. Azek terminated the traveling, but they remained in the spirit world. He seemed to be watching something or listening in on something. After 2 to 3 seconds, he said, "There aren't any problems." With that said, he brought Klein while Klein brought his marionette out of the spirit world. Meanwhile, Klein recalled the time he searched for clues to Azek's memories. Back then, the target was the ancient chronicles that Vice Admiral Ailment Tracy possessed. Back then, Azek had said, "The problem isn't serious," but in the end, he faced Demoness of Unaging Katerina. "There aren't any problems." All right, since you say so. Klein lampooned as he sized up his surroundings. It was a rather familiar environment. It was a huge ship with a mainly dark color with a ghostly green to it. It had a black tulip flag, as well as zombies, skeletons, wraiths, shadows, and other undying creatures. These creatures either directed the sails, patrolled the area, or did cannon drills. All of that proved that it was the flagship, Black Tulip, of Admiral Hell. Unlike Klein's last encounter, the Black Tulip had quite a number of living beyonders. The silver-masked captain with an exaggerated rapier, frilly shirt, a gorgeous coat, and a triangular hat with a white skull on it, Admiral Hell Ludwell, was standing by the cabin's entrance looking over. Suddenly, the black ring on Ludwell's right hand trembled and glimmered. The pale white flame in the arrogant pirate admiral's eyes wavered and finally constricted to its limits. Immediately, Ludwell bent his back, prostrated to the ground in front of Isaac Eggers, and kissed the deck under the gaze of the either glazed, surprised, or lifeless eyes. Chapter 9:14. The calling. Deep inside the mausoleum, upon seeing Admiral Hell Ludwell's reaction, Klein and the living crew of the Black Tulip could hardly believe their eyes. He originally imagined two scenarios. The first was Ludwell requesting help from a numinous episcopate demigod to ambush Gehrman Sparrow and the powerhouse backing him. This wasn't impossible since Sequence 7 of the Death Pathway was called Spirit Medium. They also had the ability to sense impending danger. The second was that Admiral Hell hadn't made any preparations. He tried resisting but ended up being easily finished off by Mr. Isaac. Klein's plan was to have Mr. Isaac deal with the demigod while he hunted Admiral Hell in the first scenario, so as to obtain his second marionette. If it were the second scenario, he could request Mr. Isaac to watch by the side as he controlled his marionette to challenge Ludwell alone. During this process, he would use creeping hunger and hide in the shadows, doing his best to stay behind the scenes so as to digest his marionette potion faster. To his surprise, Admiral Hell didn't put up a fight at all. He directly prostrated himself and kissed the deck as though he was Isaac's most loyal and humble servant. How are we going to come to blows now? Klein stared ahead blankly, somewhat at a loss for words. And it was silent across the ship. Isaac raised his hand and pressed down on his silk hat as he walked towards the prostrating Ludwell at a decent pace. 1 step. 2 steps. 3 steps. He stopped in front of Ludwell and said with a deep voice, "What stage has the numinous episcopate's artificial death project reached?" Ludwell kept his forehead peeled to the ground as he hoarsely replied, "Artificial death can already influence high-sequence beyonders who failed their advancements, but it is still unable to reply to prayers and rituals." After the description, he slightly raised his torso and took off the black, square-shaped ring from his right hand. Then, with both hands, he offered it in front of him. Silently, the ring seemed to be dragged by countless spirit bodies as it flew up and landed in Isaac's palm. Isaac studied it for a few seconds before wearing it on his left index finger. Suddenly, a terrifying and profound feeling was emanated from his body. The zombies and skeletons, who were either naked or wearing rotten leather armor, genuflected, bowing their heads as though they only dared to look at his boots. The flying wraiths and shadows landed on the deck and clung closely to it. None of them dared to float in midair again. The other pirates aboard the ship plopped to their knees, plastering their faces to the deck without daring to raise them. Klein stood to the side, watching Mr. Isaac's back in the suddenly empty scene. He turned agape, but he didn't say a word. Isaac took another 2 steps forward and came to Admiral Hell's side. Then, he turned his body and faced Klein and said to Ludwell, "You shall be his marionette for a year. When the time is up, you can return to the spirit world." Isaac said those words without any inflection, as though he wasn't determining Admiral Hell's life and death or future. Perhaps, to him, this was a trivial matter that didn't need him to care for the thoughts and feelings of the person being ordered. Ludwell's body shook violently as though he was furious and indignant. But ultimately, he didn't raise his head. He continued keeping his head peeled to the deck. "Yes, Honorable Death Consul." Just as he said that, ghastly white and dark green mysterious symbols were accentuated as they meshed together, forming an illusory bronze door. The door rapidly contracted and was imprinted inside Admiral Hell's forehead. Klein looked in surprise and puzzlement. Only when Mr. Azik nodded at him and pointed to Admiral Hell did he blankly step forward and enter a 10-meter radius. He began controlling Ludwell's spirit body threads. The pirate admiral almost leaped up a few times to flail his arms, but none of that happened. Soon, his thoughts turned sluggish as he subconsciously resisted. After a while, the silver-masked Admiral Hell Ludwell stood up. Bowing his head, he retreated to Klein's side and stood beside Winner Enzo. Azik watched the entire process in silence before finally slowly saying, "In the death pathway, high-level Beyonders have extremely suppressive powers over low-level Beyonders, I can tell. Back when I threw your copper whistle, even the Sequence 5 Admiral Hell failed to control his undead creatures." Klein nodded gently, indicating that he had taken note of it. Immediately after that, a zombie which had rotted in several areas rose up. Carrying an azure blue cufflink, it came before Klein. It was the Murloc cufflink he had lost. "Although it's useless for the current me, I've finally gotten it back." As Klein was lost in poignancy, he reached out to retrieve the item that belonged to him. Then, he saw Mr. Azik walk back and reach out to grab his shoulder. He hurriedly extended his arms to grab onto the shoulders of his marionettes, Enzo and Ludwell. All the colors saturated, brightened, and overlapped. Having entered the spirit world, Klein instinctively asked, "Mr. Azik, where do we go next?" "Berserk Sea," Azik calmly replied. He paused for a moment and then added, "Give me the copper whistle." "All right." Klein made Enzo take out the iron cigar case and retrieve the ancient cigar case. Azik reached out and took it before saying in a deep voice, "My intuition tells me that this ring left by death, together with this copper whistle and myself, should allow us to find the spot in the Berserk Sea where death perished back then." Klein subconsciously said, "My dream tells me that it's very dangerous. Perhaps we should first find the numinous episcopate members who are implementing the artificial death project. We can make decisions after receiving more detailed information from them." Azik fell silent for a few seconds. "A voice there is calling out to me." Klein turned his head to look at Mr. Azik. He saw that this man with soft facial features and weathered eyes had his facial contours furrowed. He no longer had that slight curve to his lips. Colors flashed by quickly as Azik brought Klein through the pitch-black storm that enveloped the Berserk Sea. At this moment, the dark square ring and the exquisite ancient brass whistle shimmered slightly, illuminating Azik's face. This death consul who had lived through the fourth epoch closed his eyes as he silently listened to a shout that came from an unknown location. Then, he suddenly clenched his right hand. All the scenery from the nearby spirit world was imploding, turning into a slowly spinning black vortex whose borders couldn't be seen. The vortex suddenly burgeoned, devouring Azik, Klein, and his two marionettes. Klein sensed a sudden and intense sense of dizziness as he nearly vomited on the spot. He recovered after an unknown period of time, realizing that he was inside a dark, cold mausoleum. Around him were open coffins, and inside them were rotting corpses with white feathers on their backs. "Although I warned Mr. Azik, we still ended up here." Klein was taken aback for a second as he suddenly felt a deep sense of helplessness. He turned his head to look to the side and saw Azik standing near him. He was staring intently at the flights of stairs that led deep into the mausoleum. There was a thick black gas emanating in the area as they slowly swirled like smog. The one hiding in there might very well be artificial death, Klein couldn't help but warn. Azik's facial contours were no longer as taut as he curved the corners of his mouth. "My slumber from before has allowed me to recall many more things. I saw myself seated on a bone throne, and I saw Beyonders and ordinary people lying dead in front of the throne. They hadn't done anything wrong, but they died sudden deaths all the same. One by one, they got up, turning into ghastly undead creatures that pledged allegiance to me. And I was just coldly watching them without any emotional fluctuations. I allowed the disaster to spread through the village and into the city. This made me feel unlike myself. However, I also knew very well that this might be the real me. As death consul from the fourth epoch's Balam Empire. Klein's lips quivered slightly before he pursed them tightly. Azek rubbed his temples and continued in an unperturbed tone, I sense myself returning to that past. Chapter 9:15 Another, me. Without waiting for Klein's reply, Azek, who was staring intently deep into the mausoleum, continued, I still remember my resurrection after my first death. I was lying in a pale white coffin, and I staggered to my feet. I was feeling horrified, having no idea what was happening. Nor did I know where I was. Before the clergyman collected my corpse for purification, I escaped, stumbling along the way like a wandering ghost. I crossed grasslands, villagers, and cities. I couldn't recall who I was or where I came from. No matter where I went back then, would hear all kinds of sobbing. When I watched priests presiding over mass burials, I felt sorrow in every corner. Later, I happened to rescue a noble lady and entered her manor. She was a bright and lively girl, and I was like a feral beast from the jungle. I was sensitive, suspicious, self-abased, afraid, and I often showed a cold, indifferent, cruel side that didn't match the morality of a human. She was very curious about me. No matter how I avoided her or what terrible things I did, she would approach me, infecting me with her smile. She would use interesting matters to influence me, and without realizing it, I got used to her pranks and her existence. We secretly got together. She was very worried that her father wouldn't agree to her marriage to a former tramp and present servant. Seeing her melancholic smile, I had the feeling of blood gushing through me for the first time. I rashly told her that I was leaving, but I would return with an aristocratic title and a bridal garland. I joined the army, becoming a knight. I raised a 3-meter lance and charged at enemies. Thanks to the chaos of the fourth epoch's wake in the northern continent, I became a baron and obtained a fief I could call my own. I abided by my promise, and with the king's conferment letter, family emblem, a knight's medal ribbon, and my self-made garland, I married my bride. Upon saying this, Azek's expression gradually turned gentle. As though he was reminiscing and recalling something. The corners of his mouth curled up without him realizing it. Klein's heart stirred from hearing this, as though he had met the familiar Mr. Azek again. What happened next? He carefully guided the conversation. Azek looked ahead and said, later, we built a castle on our fief. We had children, a boy. He grew up very quickly, and I could tell that he would grow up to be tall and stout. He enjoyed combat, often running around while dragging a broadsword, claiming that he wanted to become a knight. I thought it was just child's talk that wouldn't last. However, even if he broke his leg or hurt his head, he didn't abandon his training. He thought that I wouldn't be able to see him if he hid in his room grimacing while tending to his wound. He underestimated his father. All the spirits in the fief were secretly under my service. Year after year passed. I recovered more and more of my memories. My wife often grumbled that the castle was too cold and dark and that she wished to go somewhere with sunlight and warmth. I satisfied her request, but it was only much later that I realized that it wasn't because she disliked staying in the castle, but that she was afraid of the changes happening to me. She was afraid of the colder me who was becoming a stranger. She never told me these things, spending time with me like she always did. We spent a beautiful time by the seaside in the south, and we even thought of having a second child, but unfortunately, we didn't succeed. It was only when I sensed that my next death was approaching did I return to the fief, to my castle. My son, that boy told me that he wished to head to Backlund to become an attendant to viscounts or earls and begin his journey as a knight. I asked him why he had made such a choice when he was only around 10. He told me that I was his idol and role model. He wished to become a noble by being a knight like me without the help of his parents. Back then, I had already recovered most of my memories. Faced with that child, I always felt a little awkward, unfamiliar, and uncomfortable. But when I heard his answer, I still felt an indescribable joy, satisfaction, and pride. He was my son, completely different from the children I had back when I was in the Balam Empire. Klein knew that Mr. Azek was talking about his identity as Baron Lamadai. And the child who made him proud and satisfied had been poisoned to death in his middle age or advanced years. He was nailed in a coffin and even had his skull taken away by Insangwil. Azek's gaze went adrift for a moment. I died once again and woke up in a groggy manner. I instinctively left my fief and followed my prior arrangements to wander elsewhere. Every incarnation, I had a different life in the beginning. At times, I met with the sweetest love, at other times I received the most adorable daughter. The love, helplessness, and satisfaction left me taken aback, puzzled, and stumped again and again as I gradually recovered my memories. There was once a time where I was a filial son. I gave my parents pride, a beautiful life, adorable grandsons and granddaughters. But when I awoke and found myself, I recalled that in my previous incarnation, I had coldly watched their real son die in the battlefield and had seized his identity. On the one hand, I felt pain and guilt, and on the other hand, I felt it was nothing, something trivial. My inner heart seemed to dissociate into two. Back then, I had a mask that allowed me to change into anyone, but I lost it after awakening. This might have been something I deliberately lost. Klein recalled Mr. Azek's mention of a daughter who liked getting sweets from him. After some deliberation, he asked, I believe that it isn't a dissociation, but that you are fighting against madness. After losing your past memories, you, who restart your life, are always kind and warm, with rich emotions. At your present state, you probably recognize it even clearer. This might very well be the true you, your essence. And as a death console, you suffer the effects of the Beyonder characteristics' latent inclination towards losing control. You suffer the influence brought about by a high-level death pathway Beyonder. I heard that he had already gone mad after the War of the Four Emperors. Klein's words weren't without much evidence, because he only knew a few of Azek's incarnations: Baron Lamud, the father who made a swing for his daughter, the filial child, and the warm and friendly history teacher. His goal was to provide a guess, a possibility to help Mr. Azek resist the death console personality that came with his memories. It allowed him to introspect his past incarnations and use this to achieve a particular compromise with himself that wouldn't be too cold. And as he spoke, he suddenly had a new idea. Without waiting for Azek to finish digesting what he had said, he hurriedly asked, Mr. Azek, do you know about an anchor? To secure themselves, the deities and angels use anchors to prevent the Beyonder characteristics' inclination towards losing control and stop madness from corrupting them. Yes. Azek retracted his gaze and nodded. Klein wasn't too sure, but he used a rather firm tone and said, perhaps, your repeated memory loss to restart and live a new life is the anchor you use to resist madness and the loss of control. Do not abandon them. Do not forget them. That is you. After saying that, Klein added inwardly. Anchor. Azek repeated this word as his mind seemed lost. After an unknown period of time, he suddenly sighed. This might be an explanation. At least, it lessens the intensity of my mental dissociation and conflicts. However, since I've already come this far, should still head inside the mausoleum to see what's hiding there. Why is it summoning me, and what is causing me to die and revive again and again, losing my memories during the process only to find them again? This has troubled me for more than 1,000 years. It has troubled my every incarnation. I believe I can receive an answer today. The look in his eyes turned clearer as his voice seemed gentle, but there was an indescribable firmness in it. Klein wanted to stop him, but moments after he opened his mouth, he closed it again. Azek pressed down on his half-top hat. Without turning his head, he said with a gentle smile, remember to close your eyes. With that said, he walked forward, following the flights of stairs as he headed for the deep depths of the mausoleum. The wafting black fog didn't produce any more panting sounds. It slowly scattered into its surroundings, accentuating the illusory object that was coiled at the bottom. It was a massive feathered serpent that seemed to occupy an entire island. It had huge, dark green, nearly black scales. Amidst the gaps were feathers covered in yellow oily stains. On every feather, there were thin illusory black tubes extending outwards. The exaggerated feathered serpent was both illusory and real, its actual form was hardly describable. It seemed to be a combination of things incomprehensible to humans. Its eye sockets were burning with pale white flames. Its face was that of a human's. The face had bronze skin, and it had soft facial features. Beneath its right ear was a tiny black mole. It was another Azek Eggers. Chapter 9:16 Irresistible approach. Upon seeing this coiling feathered serpent deep inside the black fog, and a face at the top of the towering figure, Azek was first taken aback. Following that, the corner of his forehead throbbed as though he had been struck in the temple, splitting his head in two. Amidst the excruciating pain, several incontiguous scenes flashed in his mind. It was a feathered serpent with a face identical to his, even to the smallest detail. Above a silent land, there were countless pale corpses, floating in midair. There were clouds stacked from bones that came from different species, black tentacles that drilled out from the ground, with eyes that resembled dead fish at the tip of each tentacle. A transparent spirit body was forcefully pulled out of his body. After these flashing scenes, a pair of white flaming eyes that were on the brink of extinguishing glanced over. A white feather stained with yellow oil fluttered down, splitting Azek's transparent spirit body into two. One of the parts suddenly flew up and plunged inside the cloud of bones. The remaining part fused with a golden accessory that had appeared out of thin air. Amidst the pale white flames, it materialized back into a body of flesh and blood. This scene was like a thunder god's hammer striking down at Azek's mind, again and again, making the pain hardly bearable. He raised his hand to his head as his knees gradually buckled as he knelt on the staircase. He had finally recalled everything that had happened, and he understood the reason why he was constantly dying and reviving, always losing his memories and having to recover them every single time. His soul wasn't complete. Similarly, Azek also understood why the feathered serpent suppressing the entire space in the depths of the black fog had an identical face as his. It was him. That was the other Azek Eggers. And all of this was a concealed attempt before death's fall. If stitching souls existed, there was naturally the splitting of souls. At that moment, the crazy and powerful death had seemingly foreseen his outcome. Unwilling to die so simply, he secretly split the soul of his son, Balam Empire's death console. He took half of it away and used another item as a replacement, stitching it together with Azek's soul. It was a mystery if it was a deliberate arrangement of death, or if it was an unintended consequence of the Numinous Episcopate's artificial death project. The half-soul that had been taken away from artificial death had fused with the target of the artificial death project, the uniqueness of the death pathway. It made the latter gain certain innate abilities as it began influencing high-sequence Beyonders of the corpse collector pathway who had failed their advancement. And for the other half, although there was a replacement that prevented it from being incomplete, the incomplete soul resulted in repeated deaths and resurrection just like Sequence 4's Undying. And due to the golden accessory inside his body, and the calling from the other half-soul, Azek, who started a brand new life every incarnation, would gradually recover his past memories with the passage of time. In the past, artificial death had attempted to identify the reason, but due to the natural recovery of his memories, he was often already close to death once more. He wasn't able to perform any in-depth investigations. Furthermore, the Numinous Episcopate's artificial death project had been raised in the past few centuries. It was only in recent times that they received some level of success. That was why he never found the answer. Ha! 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 At some point in time, Azek's hands had left his head. They were placed on the staircase as his throat produced a voice that didn't sound human. Drops of sweat dripped down his forehead and hit the stone steps in front of him. They spread out into a layer of pale yellow oil, growing out into dense white feathers. At that instant, he felt the other half of his soul calling out, as well as its desire. The two selves, which had been separated for more than 1,000 years, were eager to fuse as one, to be whole again. No, Azek muttered in pain, unwilling to raise his head or reach out his right hand. He had seen it clearly. The him as a feathered serpent didn't have any reason. It was filled with extreme coldness and madness. If he became one with it again, he would probably immediately be restored to his state as a death console from before. He might even become a fake death who only had godhood with zero humanity. He would forget everything, forgetting everyone who he had once cherished. No, Azek's throat squeezed out the same word again. Irresistibly, he raised his neck bit by bit as pitch-black and gloomy scales appeared. At his forehead, something that took a life of its own protruded out. His forehead cracked as a bloody opening appeared. A golden sliver of light emitted out of nothingness, taking form inside the flesh and blood. This ancient accessory made of gold was in the shape of a tall, slender bird. Pale white flames emanated around it in the form of feathers. Inside its bronze eyes, there were shimmering layers of light that separately formed a mysterious and illusory door. The moment it appeared, Azek let out a painful growl. He raised his head completely as two wisps of pale white flames burst in his eyes that had experienced much. Deep inside the black fog, the illusory and real feathered serpent had straightened its body. It reached its head out as the two identical faces of different sizes looked at each other in silence. As four pale white flames leaped, bit by bit, Azek, whose hands were on the ground, struggled to stand up with a warped expression. Slowly, he walked to the feathered serpent known as Artificial Death. As he approached, the entire mausoleum began shaking. The surroundings turned transparent, reflecting a world with countless skeletons and shadows. Bloody arms, bluish-black vines with baby faces, and slimy tentacles with dead fish eyes or two rows of sharp teeth tore through the boundary between reality and the illusory, reaching into the mausoleum. However, they clung straight to the ground without daring to move. East Balam, Colane City. Daily Simone, who was rushing to her next target's location, suddenly stopped in her steps and held her head. What's wrong? Red Glove's team captain, Soest, asked in puzzlement. Daily frowned slightly as she answered, seemingly in reverie, I hear strange voices. I can sense the calling that stems from an unknown place. I even wish to kneel to the ground. Can the rest of you hear it? Soest prudently asked the other teammates. Just as Leonard Mitchell shook his head, he heard the slightly aged voice in his mind. Look towards the Berserk Sea. Leonard subconsciously turned his body and looked in the direction of the harbor towards the distant Berserk Sea. He saw a swath of pure, deep black darkness. There weren't any gales, massive waves, dark clouds, lightning, torrential rain, or sunlight. Although Klein had his eyes closed, his outstanding spiritual perception allowed him to sense his surroundings. When he heard the painful murmurs and shouts that sounded like Mr. Azek, he could sense seemingly corporeal silence and the aura of death. What's happening? Although the artificial death deep in the mausoleum didn't attack Mr. Azek, it has inflicted him with adverse effects. Klein's mind raced as he felt anxious and worried. His spiritual intuition told him that what was about to happen was not something he wished to see. However, he couldn't figure out what he could do. He didn't even dare open his eyes to look at Mr. Azek's present state or whatever he had encountered. This wasn't a problem that could be solved with mere courage. It was a difference in the natural order of life, an unbridgeable gap. Suddenly, Klein had a strong feeling of helplessness. However, he didn't give up as he tried hard to think of whatever items he had on him that could be of use. Creeping hunger? No, it's at a completely different level. It won't be of any use. Death knell? Even worse. Grozel's travels? I didn't bring it. Neither did I bring the Black Emperor card and Tyrant card. Fate Siphon Charm. Yes, the Fate Siphon Charm. Klein was delighted as he formulated a plan. It was to use the Fate Siphon Charm to temporarily swap his fate with Mr. Azek. He would suffer the influence created by artificial death in his place. At the very least, I still have a chance of reviving. As for Mr. Azek, the deaths he previously suffered wouldn't from the damage inflicted. Who knows if he can awaken again in such a situation? Klein didn't consider if the Fate Siphon Charm was effective on Azek and artificial death. He only wished to give it a try. He raised his right hand and reached into his pocket. Then, there was a delay in his actions. His arm rose a little before landing back in its original location. He froze for a moment as though he had been petrified into being a stone sculpture. Klein's lips quivered a few times as his expression distorted indiscernibly. Following that, he swung his right arm and reached his palm into his pocket and pulled it out. Gripped tightly in his palm was a black crystal card-like charm. At the same time, Azek was approaching the towering illusory feathered serpent. His footsteps sped up as though he was returning to his throne. However, his eyes, which had pale white flames, were filled with pain. His expression was extremely warped. "No," Azek muttered once again. Wherever his skin was exposed, white feathers stained with yellow oil grew out from the gaps of pitch-black scales. The intense shouting and desire made him lose control of himself. He was about to soar into the sky and leap towards the gigantic feathered serpent that shared his face. Pale white flames spread out from the bird-shaped accessory at his forehead, flowing towards the rest of his body. Klein's spiritual intuition was sending warnings as he hurriedly said a single word in ancient Hermes, "Fate." Just as he was about to use the charm, his surroundings suddenly quietened. There was no longer any sound. A slender, fair female palm appeared out of nowhere and pressed down on the golden bird-shaped accessory on Azek's forehead. A figure then materialized between Azek and the towering illusory feathered serpent, stopping the two's approach. With the help of this external force, Azek finally held back that desire and the irresistible calling to fuse together. The pale white flames in his eyes reflected the floating figure in midair. It was a beautiful lady wearing an ancient robe. She wore a black hood. Her face was deadpan, and her black eyes were deep and dark, devoid of spirituality. Chapter 9:17 Three Choices. The strange turn of events inside the mausoleum left Klein, who had his eyes closed and his spirituality converged, completely unaware of what was happening. He had no idea if it was something good or bad. Therefore, even though he had already chanted the activation incantation, he still didn't dare rashly use the fate siphon charm. He was afraid it would make things worse or that it would have the opposite effect. Seconds passed as Klein felt the passage of time was especially slow. He felt as though an entire century had passed. Finally, he heard Mr. Azek speak with a somewhat hoarse and uncertain tone. "It's you." Following that, an unperturbed voice that was clearly female sounded. "You have three choices. First, continue proceeding forward to seek completeness. Allow Salinger to revive within your body. The second is to have me help you extract that half-soul, allowing you to take it with you. You will think of a way to stitch it back together, but this will make you transform back to your original form. You will stop repeatedly dying and reviving, but it will not be the present you. Your past incarnations will truly reseed into being dreams. Third, it's to give up everything and directly leave. You will forever be stuck at your current level. You will have no way of advancing further. You will still die again and again, waking up with no memories, and repeatedly search for your past experiences." Klein was taken aback by what he heard. He never expected that there was another person in the depths of the mausoleum. Furthermore, she appeared to have absolute authority. She provided the former death consul, Azek Eggers, different choices that he could choose from. This is that the artificial death that's hiding deep in the black fog? No, he originally didn't seem to have any intelligence. It's been so long, and it's not like he has tried communicating. Extract the half-soul and think of a way to stitch it together. What does that mean? Azek's soul was not whole to begin with? Extract it from where? The lady speaking is actually able to do something Mr. Azek is incapable of? Also, who is Salinger? Why would he be revived in Mr. Azek's body? He is death that caused the pale disaster, Mr. Azek's father or grandfather? He foresaw his death, hence, he left a seed in Mr. Azek's body for him to revive? The first choice is definitely something to eliminate without any thought. The second and third choice each have their own problems. The former makes him not his current self. He will become an unfamiliar him. The latter is to suffer an undying curse for all eternity, never to receive salvation. If he's confident with himself, truly treating all the past incarnations as an anchor, then the second choice can be considered. It allows for reconciliation and a compromise. but this involves the splitting of a half-soul into half. It's impossible to guess what developments will happen to the other half-soul which didn't experience those incarnations in the future. The anchor might not be able to resolve the problem. Ideas flashed through Klein's mind. He was puzzled, curious, stumped, and confused. He was so near, yet so far from a solution. It was Isaac's life. It was a future he needed to face. No one else could make the decision for him. And whatever Klein needed to say had been said. He stood there helpless and worried, waiting for Mr. Isaac to speak again. Isaac looked at the beautiful hooded lady in front of him without saying a word. The pale white eyes in his eyes flickered. The illusory but real towering feathered serpent seemed to sense a negative development. It suddenly lashed out its tail, wildly sweeping it around as it lunged its head downward and opened its gaping mouth, revealing dark red flesh and fangs that were tainted with yellow oil stains. It stuck out its black serpent tongue and spat dark green slime in a bid to devour Isaac Eggers. However, all of its attempts failed to be effective. It seemed to live in another world. Amidst the unsettling silence, Isaac raised his right hand and rubbed his temples. Calmly, he said with a laugh, "Perhaps I'm accustomed to my present life. I choose the third choice." Just as he said that, the hooded lady clenched her fist, gripping the golden bird-shaped accessory tightly. Then, she retracted her arm, pulling out the ancient item from the gap in Isaac's forehead. Isaac's expression distorted once again as though he was experiencing unimaginable pain. Every drop of his blood, and in every piece of flesh, there were some parts of his soul seeping out, mixing together into a transparent soul. This soul appeared complete, but it was filled with discordant and disharmonious feelings. It was because it was half gold in color, the same all the way from the brows, eyes, to the torso, and its 4 limbs. It had an ancient simplistic beauty. As the golden bird-shaped accessory was extracted, Isaac's translucent soul began to disintegrate inch by inch, as though it was being skinned alive. His throat let out an unhuman gasping sound once again, causing Klein's head to spin and ache. It felt as though a needle had stabbed into his brain and was stirred wildly. In seconds, Isaac's spirit body completely split into 2. Half of it transformed into a golden stream that infused into the bird-shaped accessory, while the other half returned to his body, fusing with his flesh and blood. The 2 pale white flames in Isaac's eyes were extinguished as the white feathers and pitch-black scales on his body receded. His warped expression also eased as he no longer looked as savage. His expression turned slightly pale and translucent as his forehead throbbed. Clearly, he was suffering a pain that stemmed from deep within his soul body. "Thank you for your help." He bowed towards the beautiful hooded lady. He turned around and floated up the staircase, coming to Klein's side. "You can open your eyes now," Isaac said with an exhausted smile. Klein hurriedly opened his eyes and sized up Isaac. Realizing that there weren't any signs of madness or loss of control, he was completely relieved. He curiously cast his gaze deep into the mausoleum. The black fog was still emanating, completely blanketing everything underneath. Who was that? He couldn't help but ask. Isaac laughed and reached out to grip his shoulder. "Even if I were to tell you, you wouldn't be able to hear it unless she is willing to let you know." As he spoke, Klein subconsciously grabbed his 2 marionettes' shoulders. The colors around them saturated and clearly stacked upon one another. The 2 men and 2 marionettes quickly passed through the spirit world corresponding to the Berserk Sea, returning to Klein's inn in Colaine City. Isaac released his grip and pinched his forehead. With a gentle smile, he said, "I'll need to sleep for an unknown length of time in order to recover. If you have any questions, you can seek out the spirit world's 7 lights. You should already be aware of the corresponding ritual." "Mr. Isaac, are you all right?" Klein asked in concern. At the same time, he rebuked himself. How can he be fine having lost half his soul forever? Isaac laughed and said, "It's not a big deal. I'll just be maintaining my previous state, allowing me to foresee my death and arrange everything, severing ties with my original life. I'll then forget everything and reawaken in search of my past. Like before, at least you're there, someone who knows a lot about my past. If I were to forget once again, should be able to recall a lot when I receive your letter." He paused and nodded indiscernibly as he chuckled. "Sleep isn't a bad thing either. At least I'll have dreams." In my dreams, I never left, accompanying her while taking in the sun while guiding that stubborn son of mine to use the broadsword. "I'll also make a swing for that little kid that loves to wheedle." Having said that, Azek threw out the copper whistle and said with a gentle smile, "Remember to write to me. But before I awaken, I will not reply to you." Just as Klein reached out to receive the ancient and intricate copper whistle, Azek vanished from the room, his whereabouts an unknown. After blankly watching this scene for a while, Klein suddenly let out a sigh. To go anywhere else from Kolain City by land, one needed to follow the spiraling path that led upwards. After passing through the different streets, one would arrive at the peak of the city. Then, one had to descend the mountain and enter a plain. At this moment, the Red Gloves team that Soest led was standing on a square at the peak, looking down at the abnormal berserk sea. Daily Simone, who had been pressing her forehead all this time, suddenly lowered her hand as she said, feeling somewhat puzzled, "Everything has been returned to normal. There's no more problems." "Normal?" Leonard returned with a question in puzzlement. From his point of view, it was very difficult for Daly to return to normal before the end of the berserk sea's abnormality. Perhaps it's intermittent? Soest hesitatingly raised a theory. Daly was just about to answer when everyone's spiritual perception was triggered. Once again, they looked towards the berserk sea. In the swath of pure blackness, one bright star after another lit up. Backlund. Beneath St. Samuel Cathedral. Archbishop Anthony Stevenson received an emergency telegram from the sea. The telegram's content was rather simple, but it was sufficiently shocking. Gehrman Sparrow has appeared, boarding the Black Tulip with another person. He has made Ludwell into a marionette and left with the person Ludwell addressed as Death Consul. Gehrman Sparrow. Death Consul. St. Anthony silently repeated these two names. He leaned back slightly and closed his eyes. Once again, the corresponding complete information of the sealed artifact, 0 to 17, appeared in his mind. Number, 17. Name, Angel of Concealment, Danger Grade, 0, extremely dangerous. It's of the highest importance and of the highest confidentiality. It is not to be inquired, disseminated, described, or spied. Security clearance, Pope, team of researchers, and Archbishop of the Backlund Diocese, sealed method. The seal is completed through the combination of 1 to 29 and 1 to 80. Description, this isn't an item. Warning, she cannot be used. Appendix 1, this sealed artifact first appeared in the Pale Era of the Fourth Epoch. Exact year, missing. Exact date, missing. Exact location, missing. Appendix 2, based on the information, Sheikh has been awakened 5 times. Appendix 3, a limited premise is the reason behind its inability to be used. It has been confirmed that Sheikh can be used as the goddess's descent vessel. Chapter 9, 18 Guesses and Ideas. Kolain City. Inside the inn. Klein sat on a reclining chair, reaching out to receive the black tea with lemon from Winner Enzo. Beside him, Admiral Hel Ludwell stood straight, wearing a mask with a rapier by his waist. He appeared like the most loyal guard. Only at this point in time did Klein, who had completely calmed down, have the mental capacity to analyze what had happened in Death's mausoleum. Amongst all of that, what he paid most attention to was the existence that had helped Mr. Azek get out of his predicament at the critical moment and provide him with 3 choices. First, a female voice. Second, this matter is definitely advantageous to her. Otherwise, no one would cross such a great distance to provide assistance. Of course, if she happened to pass by and had helped Mr. Azek out of goodwill, that's also completely understandable and acceptable. But the problem is that the mausoleum is a product formed from Death's godly powers when he perished, a product of the characteristic, corpses, and the natural environment. Without the corresponding key, even deities can't find it. With a door that cannot be opened, how is it possible for anyone to be passing by? Also, Mr. Azek's actions had been very sudden. He didn't first seek out the members of the numinous episcopate that are carrying out the artificial death project for information. He directly followed the calling and arrived at the Berserk Sea and entered Death's treasure trove. If it's not someone who can locate me or him, or them being someone who has a strong prescient ability, there's almost no existence that can arrive in such a timely manner. Finally, the Salinger that can revive via Mr. Azek's body is almost certainly the, I'm mad, but I'm stronger, Death from the fourth epoch. That female voice directly addressed him by his name without showing any signs of respect. This. As Klein seriously analyzed the information, he suddenly had a theory, but he couldn't help but avoid the possibility. Based on what he knew, the Evernight, Death, and Giant Beyonder pathways were a group of its own. They could be interchanged at high sequences. And other than using the honorific name of Lady of Crimson or some special grade O sealed artifact to occupy a portion of the moon's authority, the goddess also had the title Mistress of Repose and Silence. That totally pointed to the underworld and Death's domain. And back at the foggy town, and with his use of the holy sword to make a vow with the goddess bearing witness, as well as the goddess clearly possessing the authority of misfortune, it made Klein believe that he had entered her special watch list, just like how he singled out certain believers using the sea god scepter. Making a bold assumption seeking careful verification, then almost all the questions can be answered if she really was the goddess. As one of the 7 orthodox deities, as one of the winners of the Pale Era, she has the level and right to address Death by his name. And having been labeled by her, once anything abnormal happens, such as me entering a strange place like Death's treasure trove, she would definitely sense it and take the necessary action in response. Furthermore, as it definitely requires some time, she didn't manage to stop it at the beginning. To her, that artificial death, or the death pathway's uniqueness that had initially come to life, clearly enhances her authority in the aspects of repose and silence. It might even allow her to directly intrude into Death's domain, just like what the Mother Tree of Desire did to the chained god. When Death perished, the 3 sequence 1 characteristics should have automatically separated. It's unknown who received them. If the goddess is searching for them, perhaps ruler of the ancient underworld, Lady of all the undead, will be added to her title. Although Mr. Azek has been pursued by the Church's high-sequence Beyonders, he has ultimately never suffered any real threats. From the looks of it, the goddess has been waiting all this time for today's development. Upon coming to this realization, Klein suddenly felt a little frightened. He was rather pious. At the very least, he superficially raised his right hand in a pious manner. Tapping 4 spots in a clockwise manner on his chest, he formed the sign of the crimson moon and muttered, "Praise the Lady." This made him recall the answer he received when he asked Snake of Fate Will Septon about obtaining the high-sequence Beyonder potion formulas of the Seer pathway. Can only be obtained from the crazy Zeradol or the Hornacis mountain range. If you are the blessed of the Evernight, treat it as though I didn't say it. After the incident at the foggy town, Klein had already discovered that heading to the Hornacis mountain range and finding Zeradol was the same choice. Even stealing the Antigonus family's notebook from St. Samuel Cathedral's basement was the same. And up to this date, he realized that the second line was not without meaning. He stroked his chin and muttered, perhaps, maybe, possibly. I'm really considered a blessed of the Evernight. Towards this, Klein wasn't too unreceptive to it. On the one hand, he had spent the first few months after coming to this world with the Church of Evernight's Tinjin Nighthawks team. He had a group of great teammates and colleagues. He had a rather heartwarming life and acceptable ideals. To this day, he still recalled the past, therefore, although he wasn't a worshipper of the Evernight goddess, he was very accepting of this deity. On the other hand, at least on what he had seen to date, the Evernight goddess had yet to show any ill intent. Instead, she had given him some blessings. Klein believed that since he had been specially marked, it was unlikely that he could be free from it any time soon. All he could do was learn to accept it and make good use of it. Of course, I can't let down my guard. In addition, I already have too many enemies in the form of the Mother Tree of Desire, True Creator, Primordial Demoness, Primordial Moon, Blasphemer Amon, Angel of Fate Ouroboros, and others. Some of them might even be able to get a hold of my location at any time. Without finding someone powerful to cozy up to, my future will really be difficult. With so many things on his plate, Klein quickly adjusted his state of mind. To him, as long as the goddess had labeled him from the moment he made the vow using the holy sword, and not earlier, as well as not constantly monitoring him, he found it acceptable. At least from the special labels afforded to me by the sea god scepter, constant monitoring isn't possible. Mr. Azek will be sleeping for a very long period of time. The goddess can't just do a divine descent as she pleases. There must be some corresponding obstacles and difficulties. Otherwise, the 7 orthodox deities would have made divine descents all across the world to resolve all kinds of problems. That's why I should keep a low profile and behave myself in the southern continent. I shouldn't try to pin my hopes on an external factor. Klein reminded himself before scrutinizing his new marionette, Admiral Hel Ludwell. To be frank, he was rather curious about the face hidden beneath the silver mask. But upon recalling how there was an anomaly when Ludwell took off his mask in their previous battle, he held back his thoughts. He planned to make the attempt again after he left the city and did it in the woods or somewhere uninhabited. After some work, Klein gained a rough understanding of his new marionette sequence and powers. Ludwell was Sequence 5 gatekeeper of the death pathway, and he wasn't a normal human. The corresponding Sequence 9 was Corpse Collector. Back in Tingen, Klein had already learned of its specifics. He knew that they possessed certain traits of a corpse. Their entire being appeared rather cold and grim, and their body temperatures were relatively low. This allowed them to avoid being attacked by dead unintelligent spirits. At the same time, they also had their physical bodies enhanced. They gained resistance to the cold, decay, and corrosiveness of cadaveric auras. They were naturally equipped with spirit vision, and they understood the characteristics and weaknesses of undead creatures. Sequence 8 was Gravedigger. Corpse collectors who advanced to this sequence become stronger. Their spirit vision was further enhanced as their agility increased. They were able to communicate with nearby spirits, allowing them to provide the Beyonder with help. Other than that, gravediggers could quickly find the weaknesses of unfamiliar undead creatures and spirit world creatures via observation. This was known as the Eye of Death. Sequence 7 Spirit Medium was a qualitative change. Beyonders of this sequence gained knowledge of various kinds of mysticism rituals related to spirits. They could directly communicate with the natural spirits and loitering dead souls in the real world. Hence, they had informants everywhere. At the same time, they could use different spirits to actualize different kinds of magic, creating various kinds of supernatural phenomena in a rather multifaceted way. Sequence 6 Spirit Guide and Sequence 5 Gatekeeper didn't experience a qualitative change from Spirit Medium other than an increase in the range for communication. Spirit guides began involving themselves with the spirit world as they began hiring messengers and receiving the help of certain spirit world creatures. Gatekeeper could sense the entrance to the underworld, allowing them to control the dead spirits inside, doing so as though they watched over the gates that separated the dead from the living from Spirit Medium onwards. With the advancement of each sequence, the quantity and quality of natural spirits, undead creatures, spirit world creatures that the Beyonders could control and order increased exponentially. Spirit Guide gained the use of the additional language of the dead that circumvented the protection provided by one's physical body. Focused on the ability to communicate with a spirit body, the ability was enhanced to giving an order, to the point of slavery. Gatekeepers could even open the mysterious gate that separated life and death to a certain extent, opening the gates to the underworld. If it wasn't for the natural restraints that Azek's copper whistle had on the corpse collector pathway's control over spirits, I probably wouldn't have even had what it takes to fight Admiral Hell back then. And even now, if not for traveling to ensure my safety, I might not be able to finish Ludwell off, even if I used demigod-level powers. In the future, I have to take note when taking revenge on Insangwil. He was once a gatekeeper after all. Klein nodded slightly, raised the cup, and drank a mouthful of black tea. As for the weapon Ludwell had, it was named Harris Rapier. It originated from a prince from the southern continent in ancient times. It didn't directly correspond to any sequence or pathway. It was more of a product that was similar to King of the North Ulysses, who gathered similar characteristics without any proper rules. It only had one beyonder power, bringing absolute destruction to the items it stabbed. As a pirate admiral with the highest bounty, Ludwell didn't only have this mystical item. Unfortunately, his most precious death ring had been taken by Azek. As for the silver mask on him, Klein temporarily had no way of taking it off for research. Also, he really doesn't like money. He has zero need for money. Klein lowered his cup and retracted his gaze. Considering how it was still early, he planned on leaving Colaine City and heading elsewhere to wait for Danitz to finish his investigations. Chapter 919, Perfect, Inference. Backlund, Sherwood Borough. Furs, who was having an afternoon nap, jolted awake from her dreams. She saw an endless grayish-white fog and Mr. Moon, who had his head bowed in prayer, clearly hearing his voice. In the southeast outskirts of Backlund, in the middle of Delaire Forest, there is an abandoned ancient castle. In it are at least 2 ancient wraiths, and other dead spirits. The possibility of other beyonders living there cannot be eliminated. The coordinates are, I finally have information on the main ingredient of scribe. Information worth 300 pounds. Furs was instantly delighted as she immediately thanked Mr. Fool and sought him to pass her message to the moon that she would make payment shortly. After completing this, she got out of bed and went to the first floor. She planned on pouring herself some wine to drink and consider when she would explore the abandoned castle, as well as the necessary preparations. For the meantime, Laymanos travels cannot be rented out. Zio needs to come along. That abandoned castle has several dead spirits and is rather dangerous. I have to consider the combination of spells. If there's anything lacking or not specialized, I'll hire Mr. World, Mr. Hanged Man, and the Sun to record the corresponding beyonder powers. Although Furs lacked actual combat experience, she had been mixing with beyonder circles for years. Later, she had joined the Tarot Club, and having heard and seen much, she naturally knew the need for preparations before any adventures. As for directly hiring Mr. World to do it, she had long struck it off her list of options. She believed that giving all the spoils and her savings to him wasn't enough to hire him. Of course, if her attempts at exploration proved that the abandoned castle was extremely dangerous, something that a beyonder at her sequence couldn't enter, she would have no choice but to shoulder an enormous debt. After all, there was only hope and a future from being alive. In theory, I shouldn't reach that stage. There are still 2 demigod-level beyonder powers left on Laymanos travels from Mr. World. At most, I'll use it first and think of means to make up for it in the future. The only problem is that the 2 demigod-level beyonder powers might not be suitable against wraiths and dead spirits. Furs sipped some black rand as her various thoughts took form. At this point, she heard a key latching into the keyhole as she instinctively looked towards the door. The door suddenly opened as Zio walked in, carrying 2 paper bags that emitted a rich fragrance. Desi pies? Furs asked immediately before frowning in puzzlement. Haven't you had lots of commissions recently? Why are you back so early? Zio threw a bag of Desi pies over and said without hiding her smile, I happened to walk past it. I also hadn't had lunch, so I planned on taking a break. Without waiting for Furs to ask further, she said, I've accumulated enough points. I can soon exchange them for the interrogator potion formula. Although her monitoring of Royal Guard Captain, Viscount Stratford, hadn't had any significant progress, it was the kind that accumulated points on a daily basis. All she needed to do was submit a passable report every week to receive the corresponding bounty. Therefore, together with the other commissions and their varying levels of success, Zio had already earned enough to obtain the interrogator potion formula. Finally, Furs sincerely felt happy for her friend. Then, she shook the wine cup in her hand. Shall we celebrate with a drink? At the same time, she also thought of something pertaining to herself. This is great. After becoming a Sequence 7, Zio should have experienced a qualitative change. It will make exploring that ancient castle a sure thing. Zio looked at the transparent liquid in the cup before shaking her head incessantly. Drinking is bad. With that said, she frowned. Besides, I abhor the smell. Before Furs could speak, she suddenly recalled something. She stood up and walked to the door. I saw the mailbox filled with things. Haven't you opened it today? I didn't have the time. Furs wore a look as though she was busy rushing out her drafts. Zio was a person of action. Ignoring her explanation, she had already headed out to clear the mailbox. About 10 seconds later, she walked back in with a stack of newspapers and a few envelopes. As she looked at the addressee, she said, "It's all yours." 2 letters from the publisher. One's an invitation letter from a surgery forum. 1 letter is from Pritz Harbor. Pritz Harbor. Furs's mind stirred as she put down her cup, and caught the letter Zio threw at her. She seemed to openly tear open all the letters in front of her friend, discovering that one of the letters was indeed from her teacher, Dorian Gray Abraham. Calderon City is in a rather special spot deep in the spirit world. I'm not sure of its origins other than it's very dangerous. A demigod had once stepped in without ever coming out. When selling the actual spirit world coordinates to that gathering's member, there's a need for you to warn him, Mr. World's target is such a dangerous spirit world city? Furs stared at the letter in her hand as her eyes widened. The Red Gloves team which had arrived at the next East Balam city had rendezvoused with the local Nighthawks, taking up an office of theirs. Everyone shall have half the day off. We will start tomorrow morning. Soas took out his pocket watch and opened it. They were about to strike a secret gathering location of the numinous episcopate to find more information of the artificial death project and dig out another batch of enemies that hid in Backlund. As for the information obtained from Ulika, they had already sent it back to Backlund via telegram. They didn't need to worry about the subsequent work. After all, they weren't the only Red Gloves team. Backlund's local Nighthawks were aplenty and powerful. Leonard and Daly were just about to seek out their lodgings to rest, and a Nighthawk with some East Balam blood walked in with a piece of paper. A new telegram from Backlund. Soas reached out to take it, and after opening it for a few seconds, he said with a grave expression, "Gehrman Sparrow has appeared again. Using divination methods, it has been confirmed that it's him." Gehrman Sparrow. Leonard wasn't surprised by this outcome. He already knew from Dwayne Dantes that his former colleague, Klein Moretti, was still alive. He curiously asked, "What did Gehrman Sparrow do again?" Soas surveyed the area and sternly said, "He boarded the Black Tulip and turned Admiral Hell Ludwell into his marionette." Admiral Hell? Ludwell? Marionette? The Red Gloves could hardly hide their astonishment as they exclaimed one after another. Even Leonard Mitchell was extremely surprised. One had to know that Admiral Hell Ludwell, who wore the ring left by death, had the highest bounty among the 7 pirate admirals. He was publicly recognized to be the strongest beneath the 4 kings. He was definitely not someone an ordinary Sequence 5 could compare to. As for Gehrman Sparrow, he had actually boarded his ship, turning Admiral Hell into his marionette despite being surrounded by the latter's, undead army and subordinates. Although they didn't know much about a faceless and a marionettist, just the term marionette was enough to let them know that Admiral Hell Ludwell's outcome was worse than death. He's already this strong? He infiltrated St. Samuel Cathedral's Cheney's Gate to meet the requirements for a demigod ritual? Leonard gradually fell silent as he didn't ask more. At this moment, Soast offered more information. According to the crew that escaped from the Black Tulip, there wasn't a fight back then. Gehrman Sparrow and another man boarded the ship. The moment Admiral Hell Ludwell saw them, he gave up any resistance and prostrated himself onto the deck, calling the man Death Consul. Later, he allowed Gehrman Sparrow to turn him into his marionette. Death Consul, Leonard subconsciously turned to look at Daly Simone. He believed that this Sequence 5 Beyonder of the Corpse Collector pathway likely knew what Death Consul meant. Daly scoffed and shook her head. "I only know that the former Balam Empire, a blood descendant of death that ruled the real world, was known as Death Consul. However, the numinous episcopate's royal faction's leader has never called himself Death Consul, another red glove, Cindy, mentioned in puzzlement. This was rather open knowledge amongst the Nighthawks. Those that reached sequence 7 and above, or those who joined the Red Gloves, had the right to be privy to this information. As for the artificial death faction, it was even more unlikely for any of them to call themselves Death Consul. Who knows? Perhaps the numinous episcopate has fractured again. Now, there's an additional Death Consul faction. Daly first made a casual comment before she thought and said, Gehrman Sparrow has a mysterious origin. His motives for infiltrating Cheney's Gate is unknown. Perhaps, it's really related to the numinous episcopate. The numinous episcopate had always been a main target that the Church of Evernight had been trying to take down. The conflict between the two ran deep. Her statement reminded Leonard Mitchell of something because he knew that Gehrman Sparrow was Klein Moretti. Furthermore, he had joined a secret organization that worshipped the Fool and represented itself with tarot cards and had a working relationship with the numinous episcopate. In the few factions of the numinous episcopate, there's no Death Consul. Admiral Hell Ludwell can almost be confirmed to be an arm of the numinous episcopate. Dealing with him is equivalent to dealing with the numinous episcopate. Dwayne Dantes once said that the members of that secret organization come from different places with different goals. Klein's goal is revenge. Could the goal of one of the members be to strike the numinous episcopate, to gradually absorb them to revive or recreate death in their own image? Since there's an undying monster like Dwayne Dantes who lived since the 4th epoch, it's normal for that secret organization to have an additional ancient Death Consul. Perhaps, his corresponding tarot card is death. As his mind raced, Leonard began believing that he had obtained the truth. Then, he made a connection with certain details. Dwayne Dantes is an undying creature who had lived since the 4th epoch. He knows the southern continent very well. He recently left Backlund and has gone missing. Leonard was alarmed. Taking the opportunity while his teammates were in discussion, he lifted his teacup and covered his mouth, softly muttering to himself, "Old man, could Dwayne Dantes be the Death Consul?" Palaz Zorost's slightly aged voice said with a smiling tone, "No, Balam Empire's Death Consul is both a rank and a title. It's also the name of the Death Pathways Sequence 2. Sequence 2. That secret organization even has a Sequence 2 angel." Leonard's pupils constricted as he muttered once again, "How are you so certain that Dwayne Dantes isn't the Death Consul? Because he's not an angel?" Palaz immediately chuckled. "No. The reason is very simple. You've seen the real Death Consul's portrait before. Back when you Nighthawks were investigating Welch's suicide. You might have even met him personally. He's a teacher at Koei University's Department of History, Isaac Eggers." Isaac Eggers. Leonard was taken aback before he came to a realization. He finally understood how Klein Moretti was able to resurrect from the dead, why he was fine suffering curses, or why he could join the secret organization symbolized by tarot cards, doing all of that while usually not showing anything special about himself. The reason was that behind Klein was a member of the secret organization with the corresponding tarot card, Death. Chapter 920 Calderon's Origins Biome, the Slums. Hooded with a mask underneath it, the hanged man Alger once again met with Admiral of Stars Catlia. At a table, the two of them sat across each other, facing each other without saying a word. Finally, Catlia said, "Have you heard the news?" Alger didn't directly answer as he returned with a question, "The one about Gehrman Sparrow?" Catlia fell silent for a few seconds and nodded. "He has turned Admiral Hell into his marionette. Be it Admiral of Blood from before or the present Admiral Hell, they were both pirates who had a higher bounty than her. No matter how confident she was of herself, she didn't believe that the two Sequence 5 elites were weaker than her. You learned of it earlier than I expected." Alger confirmed the authenticity of the news in a tactful manner. Being a member of the Church of Storms which controlled a large region of the sea, he could directly obtain the latest news from the official channels. Catlia curled her lips and said, "If the future were at sea, I might have to take days or even weeks to receive it. But I've been in Biome recently." She didn't divulge her intel source. After a pause, Admiral of Stars asked frankly, "What else do you know about this matter?" Alger shook his head. "I was trying to figure out the exact situation when I saw your signal, so I rushed here to meet you." Katlia nodded slightly. Gehrman Sparrow and Admiral Hell didn't engage in a battle. Ludwell didn't resist, because Gehrman Sparrow had boarded the Black Tulip with a man who was addressed as Death Consul. Death Consul. Alger's pupils dilated as he felt an indescribable pressure. Such a term wasn't something any random demigod could undertake. Furthermore, that wasn't something the man flaunted himself, but an honorific term that Admiral Hell Ludwell had used. Furthermore, he gave up resistance and was willing to lose his life. With the hanged man not saying a word, Katlia added, "In the Death Pathway, Death Consul is the name of the sequence too." Of course, every emperor of the Balam Empire was also given this title. Indeed, an angel from the Death Domain. Alger automatically ignored the latter possibility. After all, based on that acting method, the position of emperor was definitely held by a sequence 2 angel before the Balam Empire fell. And for someone who could make Admiral Hell become Gehrman Sparrow's marionette without putting up any resistance, they were definitely not something a mere title could accomplish. At this moment, Alger suddenly thought of something that left a deep impression on him. After Vice Admiral Hurricane Kalangos successfully fled, he was found standing by the side of an artificial lake. His face had rapidly rotted with pieces of flesh falling off. Even his eyeballs had rolled out of their sockets. It was undoubtedly the damage dealt by a potent force from the Death Domain. And Alger later confirmed that it was done by Mr. Fool's Blessed. To rapidly cause the death of a pirate admiral without him putting up any resistance, especially one who carried such a powerful sealed artifact, the assailant's level was obvious. The Church of Storm's Spellsinger of God Archbishop Snake had determined at the scene that it was done by a high-sequence Beyonder from the Death Pathway and that it was not the person he knew. Alger had no doubts about that. He believed that it was done by a Sequence 4 or Sequence 3 demigod, in other words, a saint. He also felt horrified that Mr. Fool's Blessed was a high-sequence Beyonder. Now, he secretly gulped his saliva with great difficulty, believing that he had underestimated Mr. Fool back then as well as that Blessed. That person wasn't a saint but a grounded angel, one that shared the same level as the 3 crowns of the various Orthodox churches. When it came to religion, the 3 crowns represented the various churches' pope, pontiff, or chief shepherd. A Death Consul as a Blessed. Although Mr. Fool is still recovering, the amount of strength at his disposal is quite sizable. Alger's thoughts churned as his eyes shimmered. He was momentarily at a loss for words. Katlia sensed his gloom as she asked, "You seem to have recalled something." Alger deliberated for 2 seconds before vaguely replying, "Based on what I know, Mr. Fool has a death angel amongst his blessed." "That matches," Katlia said as though she was muttering to herself. "Then why did the world promise me mythical creature blood that's not from that death angel? Is it due to having closer ties with the other one, making it easier to obtain?" Perhaps. Although Alger felt that Admiral of Stars's inference wasn't wrong, he habitually gave a non-committal answer. Katlia didn't continue on the topic as she said, "We will start the operation tonight from 7:30 to 8. If you can participate in it, head over there with me." She has finally figured out the situation with the artisan? Alger secretly heaved a sigh of relief and asked in puzzlement, "Why that time?" This wasn't the most suitable period for any covert operation. Once any mistake was made, the official Beyonders would quickly detect it and rush over. Katlia nudged the heavy glasses on her nose and said with a complicated smile, "It's because it's dinner time for them. And they will be having mushrooms for dinner." What's the connection? The experienced Alger realized that he couldn't read the subcontext of Admiral of Stars's words. East Balam, in the lush and humid forest. Klein deliberately avoided the main path and came to an uninhabited area. He planned on getting Ludwell to take off his silver mask. This wasn't only to satisfy his curiosity but for a genuine reason. The silver mask was too striking. If he didn't deal with it, there was no amount of disguising that could direct the attention of others away from it. The biggest problem for a marionettist is the marionette's identity. The more powerful the marionette, the more famous they were while alive. Bringing one along with me has the risk of being exposed. If it wasn't because I didn't have the time to finish off the pirates on the Black Tulip, I would have had the means to keep it under wraps. For example, I could continue letting Ludwell be the captain while I pretend to be his subordinate. To a faceless, that's very simple. Klein sighed as he passed through the forest. There were many mosquitoes around him, but none of them came for him. All of them were circling Admiral Hell Ludwell, trying to suck his blood in vain. Klein had given his new marionette the green essence ring which attracted mosquitoes. This was because its effects were completely overshadowed by Flower of Blood. Wearing the two rings was rather meaningless for Winner Enzo. In addition, Klein had confirmed that Ludwell's situation was special. He wasn't too afraid of being bitten by mosquitoes. After walking a distance, Klein casually tossed a coin and stopped. After a few minutes of contemplation, he decided to finish something else before removing the new marionette's mask. This was because, through this process, he could confirm the severity of the latent danger beneath the mask. Taking out the corresponding items, Klein quickly set up a ritual and moved the radio transceiver from above the gray fog to the real world. He wanted to contact Rhodes. Before he left Colane City, he had paid Miss Magician £350 for the spirit world coordinates to Calderon City. He had also been warned about the extreme dangers associated with it. Therefore, he planned on obtaining more information from two channels in order to prepare for his hunting mission. The two channels involved asking the magic mirror and red light. With Mr. Azek being in prolonged slumber, Klein decided not to hesitate further. He planned on expanding his social circle, and not just stubbornly and inflexibly stick to the Evernight goddess. He needed to find powers to balance things out. And the relatively friendly seven lights of the spirit world were the best choice. With the appearance of the radio transceiver, the surrounding woods suddenly turned gloomy. It was as though the spirit world had overlapped with the real world. In about 10 seconds, tapping sounds sounded. Illusory white paper began being spat out. Exalted Great Master, your puny, loyal and humble servant, Rhodes, is here to answer your summoning. There's temporarily no danger here. What say you? Seeing this coquettish manner of speech, Klein sighed silently and finally confirmed that he had connected to the magic mirror, Rhodes. He had previously been afraid that the white piece of paper would have the words, "I want to have a child with you." Of course, he had divined the level of danger of contacting Rhodes above the gray fog, and he obtained an answer that it was fine. However, with the mother tree of desire having a precedent of interfering with divination, as well as his misinterpretation of infiltrating St. Samuel Cathedral's Cheney's Gate, he wasn't too certain. Indeed. Klein nodded in a reserved manner before asking, "What do you know of Calderon City in the spirit world?" Amidst clicking sounds, a piece of illusory white paper exited the radio transceiver in a hesitant manner. "I can't see that city too clearly. I do not know its exact state, but I can confirm that a saint had perished in there before. There were also certain angels, travelers, and spirit world creatures who had once entered to explore it and left it alive in a relatively smooth manner. However, none of them got much out of it. Also, I know the origins of that city." Without waiting for Klein to press, more illusory white paper spat out amidst clicking sounds. Its former name was the City of the Dead. It was a grounded divine kingdom of the ancient goddess, Phoenix ancestor Gregrace. Ever since that ancient goddess opened up the underworld, her divine kingdom was moved there. The City of the Dead gradually became the holy grounds of her descendants and believers. Before Gregrace was heavily injured by the ancient sun god and had the city uprooted and thrown deep into the spirit world, none of its citizens ever came out again. The name Calderon originates from the Abraham family's angel, the first person who stepped in. In the language of the dead, it means unknown soul. Chapter 921 Politeness. First, when it came to the understanding of ancient gods, Klein knew as much as many high-sequence beyonders. After all, he had the City of Silver who had continued on from the second epoch to this day behind him. The corresponding myths that were passed down the ages had left plenty of influence. Based on what he knew, Phoenix ancestor Gregrace was a so-called ancient goddess. Because of the City of Silver's creator, the ancient sun god who eventually ended up being consumed by the kings of angels dealt heavy damage to her. Eventually, she perished towards the end of the second epoch. However, her influence had yet to dissipate to this day. Signs of her existence remained because she was the founder of the underworld. City of the Dead. Unknown soul. Ancient goddess. It sounds very dangerous. Klein looked at the radio transceiver in front of him and fell silent. Tap. 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 Another piece of illusory white paper spat out. Apart from that, I'm unsure of the rest. Great Master, I have a suggestion. Would you like to hear it? That's a nice question. Klein reined in his thoughts and nodded gently. Speak. The clacking of the radio transceiver became increasingly brisker as a new line of text quickly appeared on the illusory white paper. Regarding Calderon City, you can ask Red Light Ire Moria. I still have to ask Red Light in the end. Klein nodded slightly and switched to asking, is there any danger if I were to remove Admiral Hell Ludwell's mask? No. A decisive answer appeared before Klein's eyes. That's good, he thought and said, let's end it here for today. Great Master, wise Master, in another 1 or 2 minutes, a gaze will be cast here. Your loyal and humble servant, Rhodes, will await your next summoning. Goodbye. The radio transceiver began tapping without any hesitation. Another 1 or 2 minutes. Why didn't you say so earlier? Klein was alarmed as though he was seeing a countdown timer on a bomb. He hurriedly used the altar and material he had yet cleared to set up a sacrificial ritual. He then threw the radio transceiver above the gray fog. After doing all of this and confirming that there weren't any anomalies around him, Klein made Ludwell walk to the side and not face him directly as he took off the silver mask. Gloomy pale white light spewed out, but it wasn't as exaggerated in his battle between Klein and Ludwell. It only enveloped a small region like an extinguishing candle. Meanwhile, as the radio transceiver had been sent above the gray fog, the gloomy, cold feeling that had disappeared in the nearby forest appeared again. Furthermore, it had an indescribable sense of horror that struck at the heart. This reminded Klein of a cemetery and the legendary underworld. After waiting a few seconds, seeing that there weren't any additional abnormal developments, he made his other marionette, Winner Enzo, to circle to Ludwell's front and carefully observe the face that had been masked for extended periods of time. The face lacked flesh, its skin clung tightly to his bones without any colors. It was as translucent as crystal. Beneath the crystal, transparent and indescribable shadows quickly flowed out, at times fusing with the skull, and at other times they shrank in gaps, surfacing on his teeth. Compared to the first 1 or 2 months of his transmigration, Klein would have been shocked by Admiral Hell's appearance, but now, having already seen all kinds of odd rampagers and mutated bodies, he wasn't shocked by such looks. After another round of research, Klein completely figured out Ludwell's condition. All of this stemmed from the unique traits of him being a gatekeeper. At Sequence 5, after becoming gatekeeper, Beyonders could use their bodies as cages that belonged exclusively to the underworld, allowing them to contain a certain number of souls, deceased, and natural spirits. As such, they obtained all kinds of unique powers with powerful helpers. There was no need to bring a huge undead army around in an eye-catching manner. This was the origin of many folk tales. Another purpose of a gatekeeper was an ancient role, to guard the underworld in their bodies, preventing the souls contained within from escaping, and to use them. This similarly had the symbolism of a pair of double illusory doors. And after ancient death, Phoenix ancestor Gregrace created the underworld. It was bestowing a small amount of the Death Pathway's authority to all gatekeepers. This made Beyonders of this sequence receive an enhancement in strength. The reason why Ludwell kept wearing the mask was because he had contained a powerful underworld creature in him. On the one hand, this creature could be used by him, and on the other hand, it was eroding his body, turning him into a half-human, half-dead existence. At the same time, ultimately, this creature was innately connected to the underworld. It was attempting to open the door and return. This was a combination of a gatekeeper's own powers and authority, and with the augmentation from Death's Ring, it allowed Admiral Hel Ludwell to enlarge the door to the underworld, allowing him to steer the Black Tulip directly inside. Half-human and half-dead form. No wonder Ludwell dares to enter the underworld. A real living person probably can't survive a second inside. Yes, that underworld creature gives his body some traits of a dead soul, allowing him to extract the spirit bodies of others remotely. I had suffered from that back then. Klein thought in enlightenment as he made Ludwell wear the silver mask again. The mask's purpose was to placate the soul. It allowed the underworld creature in Ludwell's body to be in a relatively calm state most of the time. After resolving his puzzlement, Klein cast his gaze back onto the altar. He wanted to attempt to contact one of the spirit world's 7 lights. In this aspect, there were special secret deed rituals and the corresponding spirit channeling ritual he could choose from. After some consideration, Klein chose the latter. This was because a secret deed ritual required him to open up his mind and spirit, allowing the targeted existence to make contact and thus obtain certain knowledge, strength, help, and a spiritual experience. This also meant that his body's thoughts and secrets were open to that existence. And through the spirit channeling ritual, there were 2 types, direct communication and praying for a soul fall. As the spirit world's 7 lights were extremely lofty existences, Klein couldn't guarantee a response based on the ritual's request. Therefore, although he wished to communicate remotely via spirit channeling, he had to make preparations for a soul fall to show his sincerity. Lighting 3 candles and dripping liquids like mint essential oil, Klein specially took out a paper figurine and placed it on the altar for the vessel for the soul fall. If there wasn't anything similar, the supplicating target would soul fall onto him, just like how Danitz had requested Vice Admiral Iceberg Edwina's soul fall back then. There were also 2 scenarios. First, the possessed body would lose all their senses, and they would have the corresponding existence control a certain part of their body so as to facilitate providing a question and answer. The simplest example was one using the mouth to speak while the other controlled a hand to write. Klein quickly completed the first part of the ritual before he took a step back, opened his mouth, and chanted in ancient Hermes, I summon in my name, I pray to communicate with the inextinguishable light of the spirit world, the embodiment of infinite knowledge, the red who wields authority and will. The biggest difference between this spirit channeling ritual and ordinary ones was that it couldn't be directed to deities, be it the Evernight goddess or the god of knowledge and wisdom. Their honorific names couldn't appear in the ritual or else it was bound to fail. From a mysticism angle, this meant that the spirit world's 7 lights didn't serve any deity. As the words that facilitated the communication with natural spirits were said, Klein saw the 3 flames burgeon as light splattering sounds connected together as though a door of light was opening. The area around the altar suddenly turned silent and dark as pairs of unknown eyes looked over from different areas. A cold, gloomy air blew past. Apart from the 3 candles, all the items on the altar floated in midair. Among them, the paper figurine staggered straight as its surface was tainted with a thick, clean red that didn't look bloody at all. Greetings. As Klein recalled the description of the spirit world's 7 lights from some mysticism books, he spoke by following the correct way of interacting that he had concluded. He acted like he was facing a teacher. The bright red paper figurine's head moved slightly as it let out an illusory but stern voice, "Hello there." Quite polite. Indeed, spirit channeling became a soul fall. Thankfully, I made preparations. Various thoughts flashed in Klein's mind as he earnestly and politely asked, "Your Excellency Ire Moria, I have a question I would like to ask you." "You can just call me Ire Moria." "Please go ahead and ask." The paper figurine floating in midair seemed to be competing with Klein about who was more polite. "I wish to get information on Calderon City." Klein didn't change his attitude. After all, in the Foodaholic Empire, there was a proverb, "Nobody will find fault with extra courtesy." The bright red, nearly transparent paper figurine pondered for 2 seconds and said, "Can I know your purpose?" Klein didn't conceal his purpose. He frankly said, "To hunt a spirit world plunderer." The paper figurine's head moved slightly. "That's indeed something that can only be found in Calderon City with ease." Elsewhere, spirit world plunderers are like a drop of water in the ocean. They are very hard to distinguish, and even I will occasionally discover them. I'm unable to lock onto them for long periods of time. A number of them are active in the core region of Calderon City. A few are scattered in the periphery. As long as you don't attempt to go too deep inside, it's actually not too dangerous. Unfortunately, due to special reasons, us Seven Lights are prohibited from entering. Otherwise, we could still provide you with some actual help. That's formerly the divine kingdom of the ancient goddess, Gregrace? Klein's heart settled down as he asked as a form of confirming the answers. The bright red paper figurine said, yes, the ancient death wished to revive herself using this city of the dead, but she had failed completely. The authority was taken by Balaam's death. However, this also makes Calderon City more dangerous because the setup left by the ancient goddess underwent an anomaly after the failure. As for what it has turned into, I'm not too sure. Is that so? Klein nodded indiscernibly. He raised a few questions about other matters and received a rather satisfactory answer. Biyao. Outside a house near the harbor. Alger and Katlia were patiently waiting for the people inside to finish their dinner. Chapter 9:22 Mushrooms and fish. Looking at the lights that emitted out of the oriel window, the hooded and masked Alger was just about to ask about the details of the operation when he suddenly saw a shadow grow out of the rich darkness. It materialized as a lanky, pale, sickly young man. Bloodless Heath Doyle. Alger quickly recognized the man to be the second mate of the future. Heath didn't look at him as he directly said to Katlia, "Captain, they didn't notice anything and turned those mushrooms into cream of mushroom soup. They plan to use the prepared pan-fried fish as tonight's main course." Excellent. Katlia removed the heavy glasses on her nose and used her eyes, which had a mysterious purple hue, to look through the neighboring house's dining hall across the walls. Heath Doyle didn't speak further as his body instantly darkened and returned to the shadows. It was unknown where he had slunk to. After hearing their conversation, and combining it with what Ma'am Hermit had previously mentioned, Alger had a rough idea of the core element to tonight's operation: mushrooms. Poisonous mushrooms. Although he didn't know what method Admiral of Stars was using to cause the spiritual intuition of the Beyonders inside to be ineffective and not be able to distinguish normal mushrooms from poisonous mushrooms, Alger believed that there was nothing impossible in mysticism. He hesitantly said, "Will this cause Artisan Sylph's death?" Unaffiliated artisans were rather rare, so Alger didn't wish to lose such a friend if there was still room for turning things around. To him, the best case was to imprison the fellow and make him the exclusive artisan for both him and the hermit. No. Katlia calmly shook her head as she explained, "Be it from the information you gave and the observations of my crew, there's one point to take note of: Sylph doesn't like fish, and he even hates it. This might have to do with him getting a fish bone stuck in his throat when he was young. And it was because of this matter that Katlia ultimately chose the mushroom strategy. This could effectively reduce the enemy's effective strength while allowing their side to minimize any risks. The dark environment bred mushrooms that devoured flesh and blood and were the first to be eliminated by Admiral of Stars because they could let Beyonders with sharp spiritual perception sense something amiss. This was akin to facing something poisonous. In addition, Beyonders who believed in the primordial moon had a rather deep understanding of herbs, plants, and fruits. Relying on visual observation, they were likely able to identify mushrooms that posed danger. To trick them, the only way was for the food to be harmless itself. Only through its contact with something else did a mutation occur. Based on this, the mushrooms previously created by Frank were perfect. If the two conditions of fish and water weren't met, the mushrooms were ordinary mushrooms. They could neither poison a person to death or cause diarrhea. It would be digested bit by bit and be broken down into its different components before being expelled by the body. At this point, any more fish and water was useless. For this, Katlia especially got Frank to temporarily abandon his experiment and had obtained a batch of mushrooms. She also promised to hunt an Aurora Order Rose Bishop for him. "Hates fish," Alger whispered, feeling like he couldn't keep up with the hermit's thought process. He had clearly asked if the poisonous mushrooms could cause Artisan Sylph's death, but the answer he received was that the artisan wouldn't die because he didn't like fish and even hated it. Is there some connection between the two? Alger questioned inwardly in puzzlement, but he didn't say it out loud. He maintained his silence and planned to observe more and take note. After a while, there were screams from inside the house, followed by pangs of painful grunts and vomiting. Begin, Katlia issued an order in an abnormally succinct manner. Her figure instantly turned transparent, turning into a sculpture formed by countless stars. The sculpture shattered instantly as bright stars surged towards the house's door and drilled through a gap. As stars gathered inside, Katlia's figure materialized. Then, she heard howling winds and sounds of collisions. The door frame shook before the door opened. Wearing a hood and mask, Alger entered the targeted building not much slower than Admiral of Stars. He swept his gaze and quickly took in the situation at the dining hall. Artisan Sylph was retreating from the table with a look of horror. On the ground were two men and a woman who were constantly vomiting mushrooms. At their chests, their clothes had ripped apart as one mushroom after another sprouted. Upon sensing someone enter, they subconsciously looked up, revealing bunches of white spores on their faces. Under his mask, Alger's face involuntarily twitched. Although he was experienced and knowledgeable, and with him being a Beyonder who had his fair share of experience seeing horrifying scenes, such a scene still left a striking visual and mental impact on him. Katlia had expected it, but she had never expected such a harrowing sight. After a moment of surprise, she held her right hand to her mouth and blew a whistle. Illusory ropes emerged from the ground and coiled around the three primordial moon believers like snakes. Is there a way to stop this? Katlia said to the shadow in the corner. After a moment of silence, Heath Doyle's voice sounded. Frank said that he hadn't obtained a way to stop it in his experiments. The only way is cremation. Cremation. Katlia's brows quivered. Immediately, she took out some powder from a pocket and threw them out. The powders seemed to have a life of their own as they accurately landed on the three primitive believers and the various mushrooms. Silently, they burst into scarlet flames and silently burned whatever they touched. Artisan Sylph was already dumbstruck from witnessing the mutation. When someone intruded, he had thought of resisting using his mystical item, but he quickly recognized the intruder to be Admiral of Stars Katlia. Hence, he wisely gave up and stood in his spot, waiting. He knew that he was of significant value. No matter where he went, he was not someone who would immediately be killed. Furthermore, Admiral of Stars never had any infamy to her name. Worst comes to worst, I'll just have to join the Star Pirates. Besides, this pirate admiral seems to be more beautiful than the bounty notices. She exudes a completely different air. Sylph tugged at his wolf fang necklace and forced a smile, awaiting the intruder to mention her purpose. Katlia glanced at him and seriously observed his appearance. All she could confirm was that he was a classic example of someone from Intis, but she failed to find any similarities to Queen Mystic. The pirate admiral deliberated and said, I had been introduced by a friend, hoping to get you to create a mystical item, but I later discovered that you were with some primordial moon believers. The three of them aren't too strong and couldn't restrain you at all. Why do you still remain here? In this operation, Katlia's main hypothetical enemy was actually the artisan himself. This was because she could neither kill him or control him. Furthermore, he still had many well-matched mystical items, making him a powerful enemy. Yet, things developed smoothly to her surprise. Sylph said with a smile, they had strong ones in Biyao in the beginning. Using particular floral fragrances and powders, they infected me with a strange ailment, making me increasingly weaker. Katlia casually sized him up and said, you have already recovered, so why aren't you taking this opportunity to escape? Alger stood by the side silently. He didn't say a word, afraid that his voice might betray him. Artisan Sylph chuckled and said, while I was under their control, they told me that as long as I believed in the primordial moon, I could use certain rituals to treat my chronic illness. I couldn't resist the temptation and tried it, and it really succeeded. I found the feeling of being a man again. Having said that, he came to an abrupt halt, realizing that he had said too much, exposing his secret illness. This is him letting himself go too far when it comes to women, thus, slowly losing his abilities in bed? Alger chuckled inwardly. Sealf looked up and glanced at them. Seeing that no one was mocking him, he coughed slightly and continued, "It wasn't something that relied on medicine. I really recovered my young, virile state. Later, I had 2 dreams of a moon that was bloody and very enticing. I believed that I had already become a believer of the primordial moon, therefore, I didn't dare to escape." Katlia and Alger silently exchanged gazes, simultaneously passing the death sentence on him. As long as someone truly believed in an evil god, devil, or some other secret existence, unless they were willing to continue in the faith and slowly become crazier, there was no regret. Even if they were protected by official Beyonder factions and didn't suffer any problems for prolonged periods, they might end up strangling themselves in their sleep years later. This was nearly unsalvageable, unless they earned the right to receive the blessings of a grounded angel like a pope of a major church, or if they accepted being isolated by certain sealed artifacts and live underground forever. Of course, under such situations, there were also many who did nothing and managed to live to a ripe old age before dying a natural death. However, they were mostly ordinary people, targets that the evil gods, devils, and hidden existences easily ignored. As for Sealf, he was a very useful artisan. Katlia didn't mention the primordial moon believers again. To her, it wasn't a big problem whether the artisan believed in an evil god. As long as he could be communicated with to reach a deal for cooperation and not go crazy from time to time, the other matters weren't something a pirate needed to be worried about. She switched topics and said, "What mystical items do you have now? I'll choose a few and leave you with the rest." Toward such a development, artisan Sealf wasn't too surprised. She was a pirate, not a policewoman. Doing a heist in passing was extremely normal. For her to leave him some items was something he should earnestly thank her for. In fact, with his level and items, it was possible for him to successfully escape if he went all out, but he lacked the courage. "All right." Sealf took out a pair of grayish-white glasses from his breast pocket. Gargoyle glasses. As long as sight lines are met, it can cause the other party to turn numb all over as though they are being petrified. There are 2 negative effects. First, if one wears it and looks into a mirror, one will turn numb as well. Second, one's body will turn heavy, making one unagile. Isn't that the item I reserved? So it has already been made. Looking at the artisan, Alger couldn't help but narrow his eyes. Chapter 923. After effects. Sealf didn't notice the change in Alger's eyes. He pointed at one of the cremated, primordial moon believers and said, "That cane was taken from me. It's called Word of the Sea. It can release lightning at a target. Waving it and striking it will cause it to be augmented with wind blades. Apart from that, it can also create large water spheres and corrosive rainwater. It can also allow the wielder to not be afraid of deep-sea pressure. They can freely extract oxygen from the water. At the same time, it can also be used as a wand to provide flight. There are 3 negative side effects. First, it enjoys singing. Every 6 hours, it has to belt out a song. The resulting effects don't discriminate between friend or foe. Due to the different choices of songs and styles, it can make one's mind go adrift or have one's mind and soul shocked, and at other times, cause one to be irascible and be in a state of lowered reason. Of course, even without waiting 6 hours, it will also be very willing to sing if you so desire. Second, you can probably tell that it's equipped with living characteristics. Furthermore, it's one that is rather testy. It enjoys tripping, beating, or pulling the wielder downstairs when they aren't paying attention. Third, it will cause the wielder to easily be struck by lightning. Therefore, on stormy days, either don't go out or don't bring it along. This is the sealed artifact that was made from Gehrman Sparrow's ocean songster Beyonder characteristic. If he were to know that you had already made it and had allowed the primordial moon believer to take it away, you will definitely be sold to someone who is in need of you, in the form of a Beyonder characteristic. Alger looked towards the dining table and saw the black silver inlaid cane. From what he knew, regardless of whether the other negative effects were severe, mystical items with living characteristics were considered sealed artifacts. This was because there were unpredictable dangers associated with them. With Katlia and her companion not telling him that he was done, Sealth could only continue taking out mystical items with a glum face. This short knife is called Blade of Poison. The effects are obvious. There's no need for me to give any additional information, right? Every time it deals damage, it will add on a random poison. As for what it is, it's all luck. Its negative effects aren't too serious. It will only cause medical treatment to fail and the feeling of being drunk to accumulate within the wielder. Sealth continued introducing a few mystical items and finally heard Katlia say, "Excellent, the rest are yours." Phew. She still left me with 3. Not only did Sealth not bear a grudge, he felt deep down how nice a person Admiral of Stars was. It was as though he had suffered some psychological ailments. Katlia then turned to look at the hanged man. "You pick first." She knew that the World Gehrman Sparrow had commissioned a mystical item to be made by the artisan. Therefore, the hanged man had to first select the crazy adventurer's item first. Alger nodded and took the word of the sea and the gargoyle glasses. Then, he indicated that the rest were spoils of war. Katlia thought for a moment and said, "Pick another one. The rest will be mine." She wasn't too interested in the remaining mystical items because she had 2 rather powerful items that suited her. She had also obtained the Scales of Luck and Judged button later, thus, covering all her bases. Under such a situation, the stacking of negative effects was something to be considered. Unless it was something extremely special, it wasn't something she would take a second look or choose to exchange. Of course, as a pirate admiral, she never found mystical items too excessive. After all, she had to hand over some of them to the Moses ascetic order and leave the rest to reward her crew. Alger fell silent for a moment. Starting from what items and beyond her powers he had, he chose the Blade of Poison. Following that, Katlia instructed Bloodless Heath Doyle to move the mystical items that Sealth had placed on the ground, and the remnant items left by the Primordial Moon believers, out of the room. Then, she looked at the artisan with her dark purple-hued eyes. "Why do the Primordial Moon believers want to control you?" Sealth's eyes flickered. "Isn't that simple and obvious? To get me to make mystical items for them." Just as he said that, his heart skipped a beat as a result of the purple eyes that were coldly looking at him. He hurriedly added, "They also seem to have some plan that needs the help of an artisan. As for what it is, I've no idea because it hasn't started." Katlia retracted her gaze while seemingly in thought. Exchanging a silent look with the hanged man, they nodded simultaneously. They decided not to take away the artisan today and to leave him there to monitor the subsequent developments. In other words, they wanted to figure out the Primordial Moon believers' plans for monitoring him. Actually, for the hermit and the hanged man, whatever the Primordial Moon believers were plotting wasn't something they cared about. They just each had matters they were concerned about. The former used it to communicate with Queen Mystic to provide her reference material for her strategies in the supernatural world. The latter could use this matter to earn contribution points from the church, therefore, they had instantly come to a tacit agreement to investigate deeper. Of course, Alger always believed in a principle: the more information he wielded, the more benefits he could obtain from various matters. After a brief silence, Katlia said to Artisan Sealth in the same tone, "Since you're already a Primordial Moon believer, taking you with me provides me with no benefit." Sealth nodded immediately, agreeing with what she said. Katlia paused for a moment before she said, "However, I wish to establish a long-term working relationship with you. Therefore, I need a few drops of your blood. This will aid me in finding you at any time." Sealth wore a miserable look as his lips quivered, but he was unable to object to it. Phew. He suddenly exhaled and said, "Okay." With that said, he picked up a paper cutter beside him and sliced his forearm, letting a few drops of blood drip out. Katlia immediately raised her right arm and gently flicked her wrist, causing the few drops of blood to float and fly towards her. After observing the blood in her palm, this pirate admiral suddenly asked, "What's your last name?" June, Sylph replied instinctively. Katlia didn't say a word as she turned around and walked out the door. Alger followed closely behind. The room quickly turned silent as Sylph sat on the sofa. He sat there motionless for quite a while, as though he was deep in thought over the encounter, being unable to extricate himself from it. 10 minutes later, he suddenly stood up and took out a small human-shaped figurine from his inside pocket. The figurine was brass-colored, and its face was empty. Blood slowly seeped out from it and remained on its surface. Sylph hurriedly wiped the figurine's face with a handkerchief before heaving a sigh of relief. He curled the corners of his lips and silently muttered, "Thankfully I have this fate puppet. Humph, let's see how you can find me with those drops of blood. Don't even think of cursing me." In the poverty-stricken district of Biyao, on a street without any street lamps. The masked and hooded Alger looked at the hermit beside him. With a deep voice, he said, after Sylph escaped from the Church of Steam, "He has been living safe and sound to this day. This means he's not a fool. For him to so easily give you the blood in such a relaxed manner without putting up any resistance means that he has the means to avoid your tracking. Besides, he didn't mention an explanation of how the primordial moon believers found him. Logically speaking, the believers definitely would have asked him for the origins of the werewolf Beyonder characteristic, but Sylph hadn't mentioned Alger at all. As Katlia took out the pair of heavy glasses and wore it, she said without a change in tone, "It isn't used for tracking." Alger nodded in thought before bidding her farewell, turning into a dark alley. He made several detours and found a chance to remove his disguise before leaving Biyao. After he returned to the Resistance's private harbor, he boarded the Blue Avenger. His sailors had pretty much spent most of their energy and money over the past few days. So at that moment, they were all on the ship, waiting to set off for the seas again. Upon seeing him return, one of the sailors stood up immediately and asked with a smile, "Captain, have you had dinner?" "Not yet." "Make something simple for me." For the operation, Alger hadn't had a chance to fill his stomach. The sailor, who also did some cooking on the side, immediately replied, "All right. We got some fresh mushrooms in the forest today. How about I pan-fry it with some butter?" Alger's face twitched as he shook his head with a normal expression. "Searing a steak would do. Medium rare, a medium done." East Balam, by the periphery of a forest. With his 2 marionettes, Klein wasn't in a rush to leave. He entered a city and planned on getting some dyes to disguise Admiral Hell Ludwell's mask. And before that, he had other things to do. It was to seek out a helper for his exploration of the periphery of Calderon. Klein was never a lone wolf, and it was even more so the case when faced with danger. Therefore, unless he had no options, he would always invite powerhouses to provide him with help by sharing the coordinates and paying the corresponding price. He wasn't one to rashly enter. To him, being able to obtain the desired ingredient while alive was most important. "If it wasn't because I know it's impossible, I'd even wish to wait 1 to 2 weeks before I carry a baby or push a pram to head for Calderon." Klein sighed silently as he took out the adventurer's harmonica and blew into it. Silently, Rionette Tinker with her 4 heads in hand walked out of the void. Klein deliberated over his words and said, "I plan on exploring Calderon City soon. Well, I've already obtained its coordinates in the spirit world. I'm wondering if I can hire you for your help. What would be the price?" The 4 heads in Rionette Tinker's hands spoke one after another, "Won't do, I can't enter." Chapter 924 First key factor at carrying out risky operations: can't enter. The 7 lights can't enter for some special reason. Is this a restriction Calderon City has on higher-level creatures in the spirit world? However, how does Miss Messenger know of this limitation? Has she been there before? If that were the case, I didn't even need to ask Red Light or the magic mirror. Perhaps her spiritual intuition told her that? As his mind whirred, Klein slowly and silently exhaled. He then took out a gold coin and handed it to Rionette Tinker. "I understand. Thank you for the information." After one of Miss Messenger's head bit on the gold coin and retreated into the spirit world, Klein allowed his thoughts to roam as he considered how he could find other helpers. Mr. Azek has entered a state of slumber. It's unknown when he will wake up. There's no way to wait for him. Willa Septon is about to be born but is only a baby. He is still at a nadir. And even if Mam Hermit has a way to temporarily restore his power while he is weak, it's impossible for him to do something as trivial as being my bodyguard. Besides, once he leaves Backland or showcases his corresponding level, there's a very high chance that he might once again be locked on by Angel of Fate Ouroboros. Get the help of a demigod from the life school of thought through this snake of fate, such as that counselor Ricardo? That will be difficult. The life school of thought is suffering an internal divide. The counselors have too many things to do. Besides, they're running all over the world with the die of probability to leave traces to divert the Angel of Fate's attention. Queen Mystic Bernadette? I'm not too familiar with her. Besides, the fool has demigods and angels under him. A blessed like Gehrman Sparrow can always find other help. Even if I claim that it's a cooperative effort, it will also expose quite significant problems. Sigh, on the surface, the fool has angels and demigods under him, but the actual situation is that at the angel and demigod side is the fool who's just photobombing them. The chief from the City of Silver? This is indeed something that could be used as a price when he makes a request, but the problem is that he's unable to leave the forsaken land of the gods. I think I should leave this opportunity for the Bizarro Bane. Those geezers of the Sanguine. There's no suitable reason, and it's very easy for me to be exposed to Lilith. Who knows who that dead ancient goddess who hasn't truly perished is? If she is actually the primordial moon in disguise, I can forget about resurrection. Klein thought of one candidate after another, but one by one, he struck them off the list. Finally, he couldn't help but sigh. When in need, friends are always in short supply. He couldn't help but think of setting up a ritual to attempt to pray to the Evernight, the Crimson for strength, to seek the blessing of the goddess, hoping that she could directly bestow him with the true soul body and powder of a spirit world plunderer, or have some archbishop, high-ranking deacon, or secret ascetic to provide him with help. Unfortunately, all he could do was muse over the idea without actually carrying it out. Although Klein was rather accepting of the Evernight goddess and wasn't against the identity of being an Evernight blessed, he still felt extremely wary. He didn't wish to rely on a deity's bestowment for everything. Besides, he suspected that similar rituals wouldn't have any effect. This was because, with his present level and strength, he had no right to raise conditions with a sequence O. If the deity was willing to give, then she would naturally give it to him. If she didn't, praying was useless. If I have the shamelessness of old Neil, I might really try it. Back then, the goddess was willing to respond to his debt payment and resolve his constipation. She dotes on her believers pretty well. Of course, there must be certain side effects. Klein recalled the past as he sighed. He decided to change his train of thought. Since he couldn't get help from friends, he considered making use of his enemies. Perhaps I can bring the Black Emperor card, Tyrant card, and the radio transceiver. I could wait at the entrance of Calderon City. As long as King of the Five Seas Nast, high sequence beyonders of the Church of Storms, or leaders of the Rose School of Thought like Sua and the other demigods and angels rushed over, I will immediately enter that city of the dead. No, that's too explicit. King of the Five Seas Nast and the high sequence beyonders of the Church of Storms are highly unlikely to follow me into Calderon City. Instead, they will stay outside and wait for me to come out. Abomination Sua might chase after me, but he is an angel. He wouldn't be impeded by anything in the periphery of Calderon City. I'll only be inviting trouble to myself. After repeated thought, Klein finally gave up the idea of creating chaos for his benefit. He believed that it was difficult to replicate the same situation outside Biyao City from back then. It was even more so when he wasn't a high-sequence beyonder. A person who treads the edge of the abyss would fall into it sooner or later. Who else can provide me with help? Klein's gaze swept past his two marionettes as friend after friend flashed past his mind, including the members of the Tarot Club. Suddenly, he recalled something. Miss Sharon once told me that the Tuttensis II mummy is one of the keys to her advancement ritual and is very important to her. This also means that she's about to become a demigod, sequence 4 puppet of the mutant pathway. If she succeeds, I can get her to help. We have had a good partnership. Thankfully, I chose to help her. Otherwise, I wouldn't have any hope today. As Klein reeled in poignancy, he took out paper and a fountain pen. Placing the paper on Enzo's back, he scribbled, "It's been a while since we last met. I wonder how you've been recently." As he wrote, Klein suddenly stopped. He felt the opening was too off and hypocritical. Miss Sharon is a person who restrains herself. When she writes letters, she goes straight to the point without saying anything unnecessary. I have to consider her personality and be more frank. Klein thought for a few seconds before raising the previous slip of paper. Shaking it, he made it become engulfed in scarlet flames. After a few seconds of deliberation, Klein wrote on a new slip of paper, "I've already acquired the spirit world coordinates of Calderon City. If you've already become a demigod, I wish to cooperate again to receive some help. If not, there's no need to force it. I can still find other friends." Sherlock Moriarty. After folding the slip of paper and addressing it to Ma'am Miriam, Klein took out the adventurer's harmonica again and blew it. Rionette Tynker, in her dark and complicated dress, walked out of the void as though she had never left the vicinity, appearing right in front of him. Klein handed her the folded slip of paper and a gold coin before seriously exhorting her, "Send it to Backlund, Hilston, 126 Guard Street. Throw it directly into the mailbox." "All right," one of Rionette Tynker's heads said while another head but on the letter and gold coin. Upon seeing this, Klein pressed, somewhat worried, "You haven't lost the previous map, right? Do you know which borough Hilston Borough is? Do you know where Guard Street is?" The 3 other heads which Rionette Tynker held replied, "No, I know, it's very easy to find." Klein immediately heaved a sigh of relief as he politely sent off Miss Messenger. He temporarily threw the matter of Calderon City to the back of his mind and began disguising his marionette, Ludwell. The next morning, a man, with brownish skin, light curly hair, and was dressed in a formal loan attire and a silk half-top hat, entered Tnik City that bordered a forest with his 2 servants. This was a city that mainly produced timber, rubber, and special products from the forest. There was talk in the town that a few hair growth research centers and the complementing factories were established here. Having disguised himself as a local, wealthy man, Klein quickly found a hotel to stay in. Sitting on a reclining chair made of rattan, he observed his handiwork once again. Winner Enzo's skin was not only bronze, but it was now almost completely black. Together with his thin and soft hair, bushy brows, and dark shadowy facial outline, matched with Ballum-styled baggy, creased pants and a black and white top, he looked like a typical example of a local servant that hailed from a particular plantation manor. Admiral Hell Ludwell's rather resplendent clothes had become the same style as Enzo's. His exposed skin had clear burn marks, and his silver mask was now dyed with a uniform iron-black color. This made it look as though he had been disfigured due to a fire accident and that he was wearing a mask to hide his face, lest he scared any passers-by. After having his lunch which was served to his room, Klein heard stacked illusory prayers. Mail. Mr. Hanged Man? It's also possible it's Emlyn and Little Sunday. The transaction of the sequence 5 Beyonder characteristic of the vampire pathway is about to begin. Klein was just about to head for the bathroom to take first steps counterclockwise and head above the gray fog when his spiritual perception was triggered. He hurried activated his spirit vision and saw the headless Rionette Tynker appear out of the spirit world which overlapped with the real world with a letter in a head's mouth. "Miss Sharon has replied?" Klein first thanked her before receiving the letter and tearing it open to read. "Sorry, I will likely still need another 1 to 2 months of preparation. If you still need my help by then, I'll be fine with it. Sharon. 1 to 2 months. It's not like I can't wait. It's not like I've digested my marionettist potion yet." Klein nodded indiscernibly as he got a pen and some paper to reply simply, "Take your own time. There's no rush. My matter isn't urgent. I can wait. Sherlock Moriarty. After handing the letter and gold coin to Rionette Tinker and getting her to send it to Backlund, Hilston Borough, 126 Guard Street, Klein suddenly thought of a problem. During wars, scouting is necessary. How can I be rash and so careless about exploring a dangerous place like Calderon City? When Miss Sharon advances, I can head there to do some scouting and gather some intelligence without the need to take risks. For example, I can figure out exactly what restrictions there are, what kind of anomalies will happen towards death domain powers, or I can figure out whether I'm only able to enter by a fixed entrance, or if I have any way of directly returning above the gray fog from inside. After confirming all of this, I can formulate a plan and make preparations. Of course, before scouting, divination is necessary. Klein soon made up his mind and walked into the attached bathroom. Chapter 925 Choosing Clothes above the endless grayish-white fog, in the magnificent ancient hall. Klein didn't rush to do a divination. He first answered the hanged man Alger's sacrificial ritual and got the cane made from the ocean songster Beyonder characteristics to appear in front of him. Word of the Sea. This name, when transliterated to Chinese, does bring back memories. I'll just leave it at that. It's basically a weaker version of Sea God Scepter. It doesn't have demigod-level powers like lightning storm or tsunami either. There are quite a number of negative effects. As Klein recalled the hanged man's descriptions, he stroked the silver-inlaid black cane. Perhaps the mysterious space above the gray fog had naturally suppressed it, causing this Beyonder cane to not express its living characteristic. It silently lay there like it was the most common and ordinary piece of wood. Klein nodded slightly and muttered silently to himself, mystical item with living characteristics are really rather troublesome. But from a different angle, it means that they can be communicated with. The die of probability back then was quite a nasty fellow, but didn't it also become obedient after getting schooled? Besides, I can always have my servants hold it most of the time. Yes, winner Enzo will be most suitable. Although he already has 0 passive luck, he is still accumulating luck constantly to make preparations for that critical moment. Releasing a little bit of it wouldn't affect anything. This way, be it being tripped, thrown, or beaten, he would be able to smoothly avoid it and not garner the attention of others. On careful thought, the cane's pranks aren't completely useless. If I were to meet other marionettists, spirit world plunderers, or bizarro banes and lose my initiative and end up being initially controlled, my thoughts and actions would turn sluggish. It would be quite difficult to extricate myself from that state by myself. At this moment, if an uncontrollable cane were to suddenly hit me or trip me to the ground, wouldn't I be successfully escaping from my predicament? Sigh, if a mystical item's negative effects are used well, they can be quite a boon. Of course, in normal combat, such pranks can bring about unnecessary dangers. How it should be balanced or avoided will need repeated trial and error. As for the negative effects of easily being struck by lightning on a stormy day, Klein didn't mind. Firstly, unless he was in a special region, stormy weather wasn't common to begin with. It wasn't something that needed to be taken into consideration most of the time. Secondly, as a seer, divining the day's weather before heading out was a common act. Finally, if he couldn't avoid sudden flash storms, Klein could always give the cane to Enzo. This way, even if the lightning were to strike the winner, it would even up being attracted by a nearby lightning rod. Let's just hope I'm not that lightning rod. Klein gave a self-deprecating laugh as he considered the most worrisome and negative effect. It would belt out Beyonder singing every 6 hours. This was indiscriminate, and it was basically a huge AoE-1 attack. After some thought, Klein decided to communicate with the Word of Sea cane to reduce the frequency at which it sang, or to give prior warning before it sang. I had breakfast early today. It's almost time for creeping hunger to start its howling. In thought, Klein removed the human-skinned glove from his left palm and threw it at an empty spot in front of the junk pile. Right on the heels of that, he lifted the silver-inlaid black cane and threw it over. Then, he stirred some of the power of the mysterious space above the gray fog, creating a barrier that isolated all sound and images. He made creeping hunger and word of the sea spend time alone. After doing all of this, Klein rubbed his palms and conjured a pen and paper. He wrote down a divination statement: "My scouting of Calderon City's periphery today is dangerous." After putting down the dark red fountain pen, Klein removed the spirit pendulum from his left wrist. He let the topaz hang down over the paper in close proximity with it. After chanting 7 times in his mind, he opened his eyes and saw the topaz standing still and not spinning. This meant that the divination had failed. Calderon City's actual situation is a secret to the entire spirit world, and divination lacks a starting point. Besides, that was once a divine kingdom of an ancient goddess. There's a mutated resurrection setup left over there. It can similarly interfere with divination. Klein rolled up his spirit pendulum and deliberated in thought. I can only trust what Red Light said. The danger around Calderon City's periphery isn't that great. Besides, I still have marionettes. I can let them go first and confirm if that place screens the gray fog. If it can, I'll give up. If it doesn't, I'll enter myself. Klein quickly came to a decision. Without any hesitation, he waved his hand to remove the barrier he had previously created. Then, he saw the creeping hunger which had retreated to the side of the junk pile. It was propping itself up with 3 fingers while its thumb and pinky were pressing backward on Grozel's travels. It looked weak and could hardly stand. At the same time, there was a mouth in the middle of the palm. It revealed 2 illusory, white, and eerie teeth that kept gasping for air. On the other side of the barrier, the silver-inlaid black cane was on the ground. It twitched from time to time as its tip kept oozing with blue transparent water bubbles. Very good, silence at last. Upon seeing this scene, Klein muttered in gratification. Just as he said that, the word of the sea suddenly stood up. And as though it was being held, it hopped towards Klein, circling about the fool's seat and dodged elsewhere. Creeping hunger used all its 5 fingers as legs as it chased after the cane with great difficulty. Midway, it collapsed to the ground. Klein watched speechless before letting out a sigh. After fusing with Mr. A, creeping hunger seems to have a living characteristic, but this level of intelligence is way too low. It clearly grazed a wind-blessed and is capable of short-distance flight, yet, it still uses its fingers as legs to chase. After saying that, he turned his head towards the word of the sea cane which was hiding beside him. Aren't you a sequence 5 of the sailor pathway? What kind of mystical item are you if you can only hop on 1 leg? Seriously, are such low-level living characteristics equivalent to babies? No, a particular baby is way smarter than all of you. Klein reprimanded each of them and sighed as he said in amusement, "It's not like I'm a devil." Just as he said that, the glove and cane who were still stirring froze at the same moment. They didn't dare make a sound. Klein's subsequent words were left in his throat. All he could do was reach out to pick up word of the sea and kindly and sincerely speak to it. After a friendly and frank negotiation, this silver-inlaid black cane used high-frequency swaying to gesture that it would reduce its singing to a minimum. If it really couldn't hold back, it would inform its owner. The exact manner included, but was not limited to, trembling slightly or automatically moving up a few centimeters. At the same time, it raised a request via singing: never use the hand wearing creeping hunger to hold it. Of course, if its master insisted on doing so, it didn't object to it and was happy to accept it. Better than creeping hunger. It's not too stubborn. Klein beckoned for creeping hunger and wore it on his left palm. Taking a glance at the door of summoning which had been produced from the ritual, Klein began considering the items to bring on his scouting of Calderon City. Needless to say, the 2 marionettes were going. They could be used as bait, to scout the path ahead, be used as test subjects, and verify any traps. They allowed a marionettist to not need to undergo too many dangerous actions, so they were definitely going. They would be wearing Enzo's Flower of Blood ring and Ludwell's Hera sword. They were all standard equipment. In addition, Klein decided to get Enzo to carry the word of the sea. As for himself, Klein planned on heading there as a spirit body. Once anything was amiss, he would immediately end the summoning and return above the gray fog. This way, what clothes he matched was something worth considering. Azek's copper whistle? No, that is related to death, and Calderon City belongs to ancient death. There's a small possibility that this might create a terrifying anomaly, causing the danger in the core region to automatically come out. Black Emperor card or the Tyrant card? I'll be moving about the spirit world. The two marionettes are basically dead. I'm not afraid that they have their blood extracted. Ludwell is a half-human, half-dead entity. He doesn't have blood to speak of. The value of Enzo's blood only makes him appear human most of the time. And this could be recovered by using Flower of Blood. It also means that I can bring the Sea God Scepter to Calderon City. It's a place that's deep in the spirit world. It's far from the Rorstad archipelago, so I don't have to worry about being affected by the believer's prayers. The only problem is that I'll become irascible and short-tempered. It will be easy for me to become hot-headed. This is taboo when it comes to exploring. However, this is easily resolved. I'll leave it with Enzo or Ludwell. Besides, the Tyrant card's level is very high. It can produce a suppression effect to a certain degree on the Sea God Scepter, preventing me from easily flaring up. With the combination of the Tyrant card and the Sea God Scepter, I'm equivalent to half a sequence 4. This can then most effectively reduce the risk I face. In the future, even if I were to enter with Miss Sharon, I can also equip myself in such a manner. I'll get her to maintain her state as a wraith, no, an evil spirit state to circumvent all problems. I don't have to worry about the law of convergence. If Calderon City can screen the gray fog, I'll return after taking a look from the outside. No one will lock onto me or pursue me. After all, the spirit world isn't the home ground of the Sailor Pathway. If Calderon City can't screen the gray fog, and a high-sequence Beyonder of the Church of Storms really does get drawn there, I can end up using him. Amidst his thoughts, Klein suddenly reached out his hand, attracting the Tyrant card to fall into his palm. Immediately after that, he fused the card of blasphemy into his soul body. Suddenly, extreme might and terrifying auras emanated from the fool's location. A heavy papal tiara silently appeared on Klein's head as his clothes turned into a religious robe. The latter was similar in dressing as a pope from Saint Seiya, Knights of the Zodiac, which he had seen in his previous life. However, the colors were dark blue that was almost black. As howling winds sounded, the pontiff robe flared up suddenly as Klein raised his right hand and suspended himself in midair before catching the white bone scepter that flew towards him. At the tip of the scepter, the gems emitted either blinding silver or blue light like bolts of lightning that circled around the tyrant. With a thud, the word of the sea cane prostrated to the ground, right beside Klein, who was wielding the scepter and dressed like a pontiff. 1. Area of effect. Chapter 926 Spiraling City. I really do feel a little irascible, but I'm not that quick-tempered. Wearing the papal tiara and dark blue robes while wielding the sea god scepter, Klein seriously observed his new state. This meant that the Tyrant card could suppress the negative effects of the sea god scepter to a certain extent, but it wasn't able to completely eliminate it. Using cogitation, Klein composed himself and turned to look at the junk pile in the corner. Grozel's Travels? This is my strongest defensive item to this day. Besides, it also has some magical uses, but the problem is that it was made by another ancient god, Dragon of Imagination Enkwelt. Based on what Little Sun said, this Dragon King was once allies with the owner of Calderon City Ancient Death, Phoenix ancestor Greg Race. Who knows if this book would trigger any unnecessary developments. To be safe, it's best if I don't bring it. And just like Azek's copper whistle, the mutated paper figurine can't be included. It has the remnant aura of artificial death. This might have a shock and awe effect when exploring Calderon City, but it also contains plenty of latent risks. The Priest of Light Beyonder characteristic. This can effectively restrain dead spirits, a natural nemesis for the City of the Dead, but it's only an ingredient that hasn't been made into a mystical item. The effects it has is rather limited. The negative effects are extremely bad. It won't be helpful to my soul state. In addition, lightning can also purify the dead. With the sea god's scepter and word of the sea, there's no need for me to bring the priest of light beyond her characteristic. Thoughts flashed across Klein's mind as he eliminated the remaining items in the junk pile. He wore the human-skinned glove on his left hand, wielded sea god's scepter, and raised his right hand slightly. He made word of the sea fly up and land in his palm. Following that, the papal-dressed Klein changed the appearance of his soul. He hid his facial features within the shadows of the papal tiara. He slowly stood up as the dark blue robes fluttered in the wind, the white bone scepter dazzling. With just one step, Tyrant Klein passed through the door of summoning and walked out of the candlelight, arriving in the real world. He found himself in the rather spacious bathroom. After adding the fate siphon charm and death knell into his body, he opened the door and returned to the living room. He got Enzo to come over to receive word of the sea. After some thought, Klein took out death knell and handed it to Admiral Hell Ludwell. After doing all of this, he brought his 2 marionettes and relied on traveling to head for the coordinates in the spirit world that were provided by Miss Magician. The trip happened rather smoothly. The tyrant aura made all kinds of strange spirit world creatures not dare to approach him while en route. They didn't even dare look at him directly. Before long, Klein arrived at his destination. The scene in front of him looked no different from anywhere else in the spirit world. The saturated colors were overlapped, and there was some thin fog emanating everywhere. Elsewhere, in the depths, pairs of eyes moved away one after another. The papal robe's cape fluttered gently in the wind as Klein did a rough scan before getting Enzo and Ludwell to enter a blob of fog that appeared very thin and normal. Suddenly, his field of vision widened with the help of his 2 marionettes. A grand city that was of legendary proportions appeared in his eyes. This city was abnormal. It didn't develop in a vertical manner, but instead spiraled deep into the ground. It gave one the feeling of an inverted mausoleum. Its buildings had a myriad of styles, but they were equally strange. Some of them had towering pale white rock columns with a huge single house carved out at the top. Some were long and squarish, with the doors placed at the ceiling with no windows in sight. Some were built in the ground, a tombstone erected at their entrances. Some were built with white bones, messy and scattered. The closer it was to the bottom of the pit, the more completely preserved the buildings were. The closer they were to the top, the more collapsed areas there were, ones filled with the dilapidation and rot that time brought. Klein made his 2 marionettes stop. Despite standing at the edge of the city and overlooking everything, he was unable to identify what was at the bottom of the building. Deep darkness enveloped the area as though no light had been shown inside for thousands and thousands of years. After a brief observation, Enzo lowered his head and chanted using ancient Hermes, "The fool that doesn't belong to this era." The mysterious ruler above the gray fog. The king of yellow and black who wields good luck. Just as he finished the statement, Klein, who was still situated outside Calderon City, heard stacked illusory pleas. He also recognized it to be from a man with a deliberately hoarse voice. "It's the marionette's prayer from before." Klein heaved a sigh of relief as he silently muttered, "This means that Calderon City doesn't screen out the gray fog. At the very least, the outer periphery doesn't. I can enter." Although he said that to himself, he was in no way in a hurry. He subsequently controlled Ludwell to raise his left palm and spread it open. Illusory light was suddenly emitted. Following that, with a point as its origin, the area imploded, forming a pair of double bronze doors. This door was slightly blurry and extremely incorporeal. The surface was covered with countless mysterious patterns that gave one the feeling of indescribable heaviness and silence. With a creak, the mysterious bronze door shifted backward and cracked open a little. Through this crack, Klein saw the deepest and heaviest darkness. Amidst the darkness, pale white colors stirred, swirling up at times and descending at other times. It was like a river that was gushing through a night devoid of light. On its 2 sides, pale white stone columns appeared, looking extremely identical to Calderon City's interior but in a more exaggerated manner. At this moment, pairs of transparent eyes and indescribable faces suddenly appeared. They filled the illusory bronze door's crack, eagerly trying to pass through. Klein's eyes felt a slight stabbing pain as he immediately made Ludwell clench his left palm. Thud. The illusory door, covered in mysterious patterns, was pushed by an invisible force as it closed, disappearing from Enzo's sight. This mysterious door that separates life from death and leads to the underworld has apparently changed its course. It's no longer the underworld behind the door, but the core region of Calderon City. The deepest point at the bottom of the pit? Wearing the papal tiara while wielding the sea god scepter, Klein nodded in thought. This way, many of the powers of the death domain was remade in Calderon City, causing an anomaly. With this knowledge in mind, Klein once again got Ludwell to raise his left arm. The left part of this marionette's body rapidly turned illusory as dark green specks appeared, as though he had turned into a wraith or specter. His arm began to stop abiding by the laws of reality as it suddenly extended into the distance. The center of its palm was abnormally white with an illusory face protruding from it. The face had its mouth half open as its tongue was sharp like a snake's. It was covered in white fur. In a completely surreal manner, the tongue flicked out far into the distance. It was as though it could drill directly into a human's body and absorb one's soul. Indeed, the death envoy powers Ludwell gets from the underworld creature inside his body has mutated. Not only has it been enhanced, but it has also gone from remotely extracting spirit bodies to directly consuming them. Klein stood at Calderon City's entrance and made Admiral Hell display all kinds of beyonder powers of the death domain. Through that, he gleaned the differences that there were from the usual outcome. The thing they had in common was that all of them had become more powerful. Then, Klein experimented by making Enzo use the specialness of his body in the various powers from Flower of Blood and Word of the Sea before coming up with a conclusion. Aspects in the fate domain aren't affected. Lightning strike is suppressed, making it much weaker. Unable to fly too high. Powers like wind blades, singing, illusory scales, balance, and water membrane undergo no changes. With the end of these experiments, Klein made Enzo and Ludwell walk down the pale white stairs, clinging closely to the periphery of Calderon City. The buildings there had already completely collapsed. As the 200-meter threshold approached, Klein raised his right hand and pressed down on his face that hid in the shadows of the papal tiara. Then, wielding the sea god scepter, he stepped into the thin fog. His mind instantly felt a little groggy as the scene before him changed. He had already entered the city of the dead, Calderon City. Enduring the irascible feelings within him, Klein made his left glove turn dark. His body turned illusory as it was tainted by a dark color, turning him into a shadow. Only the sea god scepter in his hand continued emitting silver or blue beams of light. Using the soul screening and the tyrant card suppression to hide the light, Klein floated diagonally ahead, slinking into the shadows of the collapsed buildings. He followed closely behind the two marionettes, beginning to perform an initial inspection of Calderon City's outer region. As he traversed the area, Klein gradually noticed something amiss. It was too quiet. It was so quiet that it was as though the entire city was dead. Even bugs had failed to survive. Based on what Erodes and Red Light Ire Moria had said, Phoenix ancestor Gregrace had uprooted Calderon City and thrown it deep into the spirit world. Before doing so, the residents inside the city were allowed to leave. Occasionally, there would be other spirit world creatures entering. But now, not only were there no active creatures in the peripheral region, there weren't even skeletons, zombies, or even one or two non-bone-like buildings. Klein tensed up more and more. With Enzo's and Ludwell's vision, he carefully observed his surroundings. During this process, his gaze swept across a broken pale white column. The ancient but damaged building at the top had a disc burnished from gold inside. The disc's smooth surface reflected a figure, but it wasn't Enzo, but Klein in his papal tiara and dark blue robe. This Klein had a gloomy demeanor. His face was pale and his eyes were listless as though he had long been dead. Chapter 927 Tyrants might hiding in the shadows. Klein's heart tightened. He then quickly calmed down without showing any signs of horror. This was because he was extremely certain that the reflection on the golden disk's smooth surface wasn't him, at least, it wasn't the real him. If it really was him, Enzo would have seen the gray fog, seeing magical scenes that resembled a mythical creature form. This would have caused Klein to faint immediately. Since I'm completely fine, it means that the reflection isn't of me. Klein activated his spirit body thread's vision, controlled Enzo, and raised word of the sea. He approached the pale white collapsed column and the ancient building which remained in shambles while secretly releasing some of his luck. The swarthy marionette approached the golden disc one step at a time. Bending his back and raising the cane, he carefully observed the area. The disc had 2 layers, an inner and outer layer. The core region was as smooth as a mirror with very few patterns. The boundaries were engraved with bird-like creatures. Its entirety had an ancient magnificence to it. The figure it reflected remained the same. Despite reflecting Enzo, it reflected the gloomy, pale Klein with listless eyes. Even the sea god's scepter, the papal tiara and papal robe that came with the tyrant card weren't missing. If it wasn't because of the lack of the gray fog, Klein definitely would have imagined that the disc could influence himself through a marionette and spirit body threads. Or perhaps it would be like what the Saint of Darkness back at the ruins of the Battle of Gods had encountered, having himself dissociate without realizing it. What does this actually mean? Klein calmly grew out of the shadows, restoring his appearance back when he first stepped into Calderon City. Then, using his Beyonder powers as a clown, he produced his present state in his mind. Holding the white bone scepter with embedded blue gems, he wore a caped papal robe with a papal tiara with different gems dotting it. His face was hidden in the shadows, appearing somewhat blurry. His entire body exhibited a gloomy and cadaveric air, as though he was a zombie that was recently dug out. Klein was alarmed. He never expected to really experience such changes. Apart from the gray fogs mixing with reality, the reflection on the golden disc really was him. Something that it doesn't involve the gray fog, it isn't anything to worry too much about, he hurriedly consoled himself as he calmed his mental state. Normally, with Klein's rich experience and good ability to adapt, there was nothing he needed to do at the moment. But first, considering how he was holding the sea god's scepter that easily made him rash, he needed to pay constant attention. Second, he knew that this was once Phoenix ancestor Grigrace's divine kingdom which contained the setup required for her revival. There was bound to be all kinds of abnormalities. Therefore, he was more nervous than ever before. Getting Ludwell to return, he used his Beyonder powers to do a thorough inspection of himself before gaining a preliminary understanding. When living creatures enter Calderon City, they will naturally transform into the deceased. This is similar to the underworld, but there's a fundamental difference. Here, living creatures won't die an abrupt death before slowly turning into mindless undead creatures. Instead, they will directly turn into dead spirits. I didn't notice it before because Enzo and Ludwell are essentially dead, so there's no need for them to be converted. Rhodes and Red Light Ire Moria didn't mention this because the travelers, spirit world creatures, and angels automatically recovered after leaving alive. This kind of transformation is unable to affect the powers of the gray fog that fuses with reality. And the disc reflects the dead me, not all of me, or the me that has had some interaction with Calderon. Klein was more inclined to believe in the latter, but he wasn't too sure. At this moment, he heard a sound coming from nearby. Clang. 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 The sound was heavy but crisp, as though someone was striking metal heavily. Klein wasn't in a hurry to react. He carefully listened for 2 seconds before letting Enzo put down the heavy golden disc and walk towards a nearby broken tombstone. The halved tombstone corresponded to a building that developed further underground. On top of it were the words written with the language of the dead, a quick-tempered fellow, one who died as a result of comparing which was harder, his head or someone else's hammer. Enzo circled around the damaged tombstone and arrived at the entrance to the tomb. He reached out his left hand and turned the knob, pulling open the door. Amidst the rough grinding sounds of rust, the heavy door slowly opened. So. Pale white beams of arrow-like light flew out. They brushed past Enzo's face, the top of his head, torso, and inner thighs and flew into the distance, stabbing into the ground before vanishing. However, Winner Enzo was completely unharmed. I have to say that such a marionette is excellent for dangerous explorations. Klein sighed inwardly as he made Enzo cast his gaze down the building. It was a blacksmith giant with bluish-black skin and a head that looked like a ruptured watermelon held onto a hammer as he kept striking an anvil, but there was nothing on it. As the giant with the cracked head had normal spirit body threads and wasn't the soul avatar of someone else, Klein secretly heaved a sigh of relief. Just as he was about to get Enzo to take a more thorough look, his body suddenly turned numb as his thoughts turned sluggish. This feeling was something he had felt before. Back in Tianjin, he had been in a similar state when he was under sealed artifact 2-049's influence. Klein didn't know better back then, but after becoming a marionettist, he knew that this meant that his spirit body threads had been controlled by the sealed artifact. This also meant that someone was controlling his spirit body threads. Furthermore, the difference from before was that, not only were his joints rusting, as though someone had infused glue into them, he also felt a strong numbness as if he had been struck by lightning. It made his actions become harder. No good. It's the spirit world plunderer. I was guarded against its use of soul avatar. It distracted me, and secretly approached, but I never expected that it not only had a soul avatar, but it also has a partner. That giant blacksmith made me careless. And the marionette's existence made me ignore my own safety. Various thoughts emerged in Klein's mind involuntarily as it disrupted his normal thoughts of trying to save himself. At this moment, the giant blacksmith with a ruptured head raised his hammer and rushed over to Enzo, hoping to smash him into a pulp. And by Klein's neck, there was a cold wind blowing at it, pricking his hair up one by one. The surroundings were abnormally silent before, but now, all kinds of strange creatures emerged from the pale white stone column, run-down houses, and the tombstone's tomb. Some of them only had half a body. Others were transparent and nearly invisible. Some were stretched and soft like noodles. Some had a ruptured chest with bloody innards. Some had dark green faces that resembled that of an evil spirit. Others had eyes growing everywhere around their body. There were also others who looked like jellyfish that lived in the air. Countless gazes were cast onto Klein from different areas. They were without any feelings, just indifferent. At this moment, Klein opened his mouth with great difficulty as he said a word slowly, "Sing." Just as he said that, the glove on his left palm opened its mouth, revealing its white teeth. "Praise you, the Lord that created everything, the Lord who reigns behind the curtain of shadows, the degenerated nature of all living things." Amidst this jarring voice that resembled blackboard scratching sounds, Enzo, who had been thrown to the ground, successfully avoided the hammer strike as Word of the Sea began spewing out water bubbles in excitement. Break! 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 Klein suddenly felt his head ache as his ability to think was instantly recovered, no longer having disconnected thoughts for a brief moment. However, his body remained rusted as his body was filled with numbness. Following that, he relied on his spirituality while motionless, controlling Ludwell, who had returned to his side, to punch him with his left fist. Bang! Klein staggered back, instantly extricating himself from the numb and sluggish state. Then, wearing the papal tiara, he became hot-headed as he spread his papal cape and raised sea god scepter. The blue gems lit up one after another as a bright silver bolt of lightning blasted down. The bolt of lightning spread into branches, blanketing Calderon City's periphery for hundreds of meters with a lightning forest. The destructive aura and sense of destruction were brought to the forefront. The strange creatures that had charged out from various spots shattered, evaporated, and completely vanished as a result of the swath of silver. Moments after the silver storm quelled, Tyrant Klein's sea god scepter emitted a blinding light once again. The rapturous bolts of lightning snaked, embroiled the area, smiting down again and again like a huge wave. After 2 repeated casts of lightning storm, Klein was exhausted as he found his calm again. His heart beat suddenly as he recalled something. Lightning storm was indiscriminate when it struck. Apart from the sea god's scepter wielding him and the partner who stood beside him, everything else suffered a decimating blast. This also meant that Ludwell was still fine, but there was a high chance of Enzo being wiped out. Klein instinctively looked over and saw Enzo curled by the side of the halved tombstone. Behind him was the huge metallic hammer which still had tiny bolts of lightning snaking around. Not far from it was two non-human charred legs. The tomb corresponding to the tombstone had already collapsed. The iron-black tiles that landed on the ground still had remnant silver bolts of lightning sizzling away. As expected of a winner. He didn't even die despite such an onslaught. The amount of luck he accumulated has probably been passively expended. Klein felt relieved as he activated his spirit body thread's vision to observe his surroundings. He was searching for the spirit world plunderer. He believed that the range of a spirit world plunderer's controlling of spirit body threads couldn't match that of a lightning storm. The already dilapidated buildings had nearly been leveled. The remaining stone pieces and bones were mostly charred black. Even the heavy golden disc was in shambles. Suddenly, a figure emerged from the rubble more than 100 meters away from Klein. It was wearing a translucent white robe. It didn't have a head or limbs. It appeared like it was being propped up by an invisible person. At that moment, it looked like it was in a sorry state, with wounds and black marks everywhere. This is the spirit world plunderer, I suppose. My rash usage of 2 lightning storms seems to have restrained it. Upon seeing this scene, Klein had such thoughts flash through his mind. You're tuning into the Biyao's Wuxia Chronicles YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.